Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Last Thanksgiving, I was working late as usual. I'm 26 years old, living in Seattle, and I take the ferry daily to my apartment on Bainbridge Island. Being one of the newest employees at the firm, I got stuck with the most thankless shift, preventing me from leaving before 7 in the evening. My family had already left for my aunt's house on the mainland 3 hours earlier, so I had to make the journey alone. I grabbed a quick sandwich at the terminal before boarding the 40-minute ferry ride. Once on the mainland, I got into my car and entered the address into my GPS. It didn't take long before the rain started, first just a drizzle, then quickly turning into a torrential downpour. I arrived at my destination around 8:30. By that time, the rain was coming down in sheets, accompanied by powerful gusts of wind bending the trees along the driveway. I rushed inside, carrying the gifts I had brought to distribute. Everyone was already halfway through dinner, but they welcomed me warmly. It was good to see them all after months of nothing but video calls and text messages. I stayed there until almost midnight, well beyond when the rest of my immediate family had departed. I used those extra minutes to catch up with cousins I rarely see and enjoy the festive atmosphere. But when I finally stepped outside, the scene was frightening. The roads were flooded with at least 6 inches of water, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. The drive back was terrifying. The roads were barely passable, and I had to drive at less than 20 miles per hour. The streets were deserted. Apparently, everyone else had the good sense to return home before conditions deteriorated further. As I turned onto Highway 9, which would normally be busy, I found myself in complete emptiness. Not a single car, no lights in the stores, nothing but darkness and sheets of rain illuminated by my headlights. Then I noticed in the distance the bright white glow of hazard lights flashing. There was steam or smoke rising from what appeared to be a vehicle, creating ghostly patterns in the beam of my headlights. As I approached, I saw a figure standing beside the car, waving frantically. They seemed to need help desperately. I pulled up behind their vehicle, thinking I could at least offer my phone or a ride somewhere. The moment I opened my door, the person rushed toward me, not even giving me time to fully process what was happening. It was a woman, maybe 5'7", wearing a hooded raincoat that obscured much of her face. She asked me abruptly if I knew anything about engines. I explained that I wasn't very knowledgeable about cars. She responded quickly, almost dismissively, saying that was fine. Then she went back to her car, retrieved something from the trunk, and returned. She instructed me to wait near the trunk while she checked under the hood. I was confused by her request, but complied anyway. The woman opened the hood and began fiddling with something, but my view was blocked by the raised trunk lid. With the howling wind and pounding rain drowning out all other sounds, I couldn't hear what she was doing. I leaned against the back of the car, trying to steady myself on the slick pavement, when I heard rapid footsteps behind me. Suddenly, I was shoved forcefully toward the open trunk. She tried to slam it shut, but I raised my legs and pushed upward against the lid, fighting through the panic rising in my chest. Managing to force the trunk open completely, I had only seconds to act. I grabbed my keys from my pocket as she lunged at me again. When she reached for my throat, I drove my apartment key into her shoulder. She fell to her knees with a scream that echoed through the empty street. I was already in my car with half the journey back to the ferry terminal completed when I finally saw her in my rearview mirror, staggering to her feet. My hands trembling uncontrollably, I fumbled with my phone to dial 911 to report what had happened. At the dispatcher's instruction, I returned to the scene about 15 minutes later, only to be greeted by the red and blue lights reflecting off the rain-slicked road. The police had already secured the area and were awaiting the arrival of an ambulance. I stayed there, watching everything unfold from the safety of my car, and nothing in my life had ever given me such an intense feeling of relief mixed with lingering terror. Later that night, I finally made it home safely, collapsing on my couch around 2 in the morning. I called my family, despite the hour, and told them everything that had happened. Even with their comforting words, that Thanksgiving was marked by a trauma I had never experienced before. The police later told me that 3 similar incidents had been reported in the area over the past month, but they hadn't been able to identify the perpetrator. I gave my statement twice more in the following days. To this day, that remains, without a doubt, one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I no longer stop for strangers on deserted roads, no matter how desperate they might appear. Some lessons are learned the hard way, and sometimes survival comes down to mere seconds of quick thinking. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. When I was a kid, I had this dream that kept me up at night, catching Santa Claus at the exact moment he left presents at our farmhouse in rural Montana. He always came on December 22nd, because we'd drive to my grandma's place in Billings for Christmas Eve. My parents arranged everything carefully. We'd collect the freshly delivered packages from the jolly old man and take them to open with the whole family at Grandma's. Christmas was magical, and our parents made sure we experienced that magic to the fullest. One night during the transition from December 21st to 22nd, something different happened. I was 7 years old and simply couldn't fall asleep. My little sister was sleeping deeply beside me, mumbling words while dreaming, but sleep wouldn't come to me. I felt strange, with an overwhelming thirst, but my fear of the dark prevented me from going downstairs. That's when I heard noises coming from below. I decided to seize the opportunity, thinking that perhaps one of my parents was awake. I slipped on my wool slippers, a gift from last Christmas, and left the bedroom. As soon as I closed the door behind me, I heard my father snoring loudly. I immediately assumed it must be my mother, but peering through the crack in their bedroom door, I saw both of them sleeping peacefully. Yet the sound continued. Someone was downstairs. It was a specific noise, like someone touching the ornaments on our pine Christmas tree. Without hesitation, I thought it must be Santa Claus. I was certain that if I was very careful and quiet, I would finally catch him in the act. I couldn't wake my sister. There wasn't time. I knelt down and began crawling across the wooden floorboards toward the staircase, not making a sound. When I reached the stairs, I carefully peered down. In the dim glow of the Christmas lights, I spotted a figure near the tree. It was a child about my size, with their back to me. They were holding one of the decorative ornaments, a hand-blown glass sphere with swirls of silver and deep blue that my grandfather had brought from Europe decades ago. Startled, I let out a small gasp, and hearing me, the child turned to face me. Their face was pale as mountain snow, completely smooth. They had eyes and a nose, but no mouth at all. Frightened, I scrambled backward, debating whether I should call my parents, but something held me back. I was afraid of being blamed if that child was damaging the presents. My child's mind was thinking in a confused way. For a moment, I decided that perhaps it wasn't real. I needed to be sure. I gathered my courage and looked again, peering once more down the staircase. But the living room was empty, the tree untouched. That's when I heard something right beside me on the steps. I glanced over, and there he was, the mouthless boy, standing in the middle of the staircase, watching me with wide eyes. He was making a strange sound, as if trying to say something but couldn't. It was then that fear completely overtook me. I don't know where I found such strength, but I began screaming and thrashing uncontrollably. I felt arms holding me, but I continued kicking and screaming until I realized they were my parents, alarmed by my cries, who had come to help me. But in that moment, all I could do was fight against the terror I had just witnessed. I regained my senses about a minute later, surrounded by my entire family. I desperately tried to convince them of what I had just seen. To me, it was absolutely real, but they insisted. "You were just sleepwalking," they said, assuring me that I had probably gotten out of bed while still asleep, mixing dreams with reality. Gradually, they convinced me, and as the hours passed, the fear dissipated, and I finally managed to fall into a peaceful sleep. The next day, I had already forgotten the episode and happily celebrated Christmas at my grandmother's house. However, when we returned home 3 days later, something strange happened, something no one could explain. One of the decorative ornaments from the tree had disappeared. It was exactly the one I had seen the boy touch, that unique sphere with swirls of silver and deep blue. We searched everywhere, but it never reappeared. It simply vanished, as if it had evaporated into the thin Montana winter air. Years later, when I was helping my parents pack to move to Arizona, I found an old newspaper clipping in our attic. It was from the 1950s, showing our farmhouse with a family standing outside. Among them was a small boy who looked strangely familiar. The caption mentioned a tragic accident where their 7-year-old son had choked on a Christmas ornament. I never told my parents about finding that clipping, but sometimes on cold December nights, I still think about the boy with no mouth who just wanted to be seen. Tell us a ghost story, Grandma. Please tell us a spooky tale. I would beg my grandmother every time she came to spend Thanksgiving with us in our small Vermont town. Most times she'd decline, but when she did agree, she always had something new to share. Stories she claimed to have experienced in the Appalachian mountain community where she grew up. One year, she took advantage of my parents heading into town to pick up some last-minute groceries for our Thanksgiving feast. She called me and my cousins over, looked each of us in the eyes, then glanced out the window to confirm we were truly alone before speaking. "I'm going to tell you something I probably shouldn't," she said, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "But since you want a ghost story, you'll get one." She settled into her favorite armchair, the old leather creaking beneath her. "Do you know why we never spend Thanksgiving at my house? Did your parents ever tell you?" We all shook our heads silently, waiting for her to continue. "The reason," she said, "was my father. According to my grandmother, we were fortunate to have never met him. He was a cruel man who mistreated his children whenever possible. As the years passed and he grew too frail to hit them, he found other ways to inflict pain. He never wanted his children to leave the mountains. Whenever one of them decided to seek a better life elsewhere, he made a point of declaring them dead to him. As if that wasn't enough," my grandmother continued, "he claimed to cast curses and practice dark magic to ensure we couldn't prosper away from home, forcing us to return. He often proclaimed himself to be a practitioner of mountain hexcraft. Despite these threats, none of my grandmother's siblings ever returned. She began to think it was all just empty threats meant to frighten her, as she was the only one who had stayed behind to care for him. 'If you ever abandon me too,' he would say to her, 'I'll never rest. I'll pull at your feet no matter where you are.'" Grandmother paused her story and went to the kitchen to brew some coffee, almost as if she needed courage to continue. Before resuming, she made us swear we would never repeat any of this to our parents while we were still children. We promised. She told us that when she met my grandfather in the summer of 1958, she decided to leave the mountains. Her father never forgave her. Even from a distance, my grandmother felt his attempts to disrupt her life, as if his mountain hexes could cross the miles between them. They didn't speak for over 25 years. Still, my grandmother and her siblings always sent money and arranged for care, but he never answered a single phone call. Eventually, they stopped trying. Then, on December 23rd, 1983, a neighbor from the mountains called. She told my grandmother that her father was dying and would pass on Thanksgiving Day, and that she should come home immediately. My grandmother hesitated. She remembered the times her father had lied to manipulate his children, and that certainty about the date of death seemed like another trap. Besides, it was my first Thanksgiving as her grandchild. She couldn't simply leave. She felt she had said goodbye to that past long ago, and the pain of revisiting it would be too great. Her desire to move forward spoke louder, so she told the caller she wouldn't return. On November 26th, another neighbor called to inform her that her father had indeed died on Thanksgiving, and that she needed to come back to handle the documents and other matters. My grandmother notified her siblings, but none wanted to accompany her. She went alone. Despite everything her father had done, she didn't want to leave anything unfinished. She felt it was her duty to bury him and fulfill any last wishes. When she arrived in the mountains, she discovered the burial had already taken place. Everything was resolved. Only the woman who had called approached her to deliver a message. She explained that her father's last wish was for my grandmother to receive a small note. On the piece of paper was written, I'll visit you every Thanksgiving, ungrateful daughter. My grandmother paused again, looked out the window as if searching for something hidden in the darkness, then leaned in close to us and whispered, almost like sharing a secret, "He kept his promise. Every Thanksgiving, somehow, he appears." That was why they never spent Thanksgiving at her house. They made sure to be far away so he couldn't find them. At that moment, we heard a noise outside. We froze in terror, but it was just my parents returning with the groceries. My cousins and I deeply regretted insisting on hearing that story. We weren't prepared for it. Over time, we learned to recall these stories with a mixture of fear and affection. When my grandmother passed away 7 years ago, we continued sharing the stories she told us. But curiously, this one was never mentioned. It was as if, for some reason, we preferred to forget it. Even so, we noticed something peculiar. Nobody, absolutely nobody, spent Thanksgiving in that house. My Aunt Elaine, who had inherited the place, also left during that time of year without ever offering explanations. During Thanksgiving of 2021, after a long period without family gatherings due to the pandemic, we met again at my parents' house to take advantage of their spacious backyard. That year, a biting cold had settled over the region. They asked me to go to Aunt Elaine's house, my grandmother's old place, to retrieve a space heater. I went without thinking about any of the old stories. I arrived, found the heater, and placed it near the door to take with me. But for some inexplicable reason, I felt the need to use the bathroom before leaving. The house was completely silent, everything dark, with only the sound of the wind in the background. As I exited the bathroom, as if something had awakened within me, the memory of that story came flooding back. At the same moment, I heard a woman's cough coming from the backyard. The sound echoed through the house. I hesitated, but the cough repeated. It couldn't possibly have come from a neighboring house. I felt I needed to check. I was an adult now. Ghost stories shouldn't frighten me anymore, right? I walked toward the back door, while the light outside illuminated part of the nearby window. And that night, I saw what I will never forget. The shadow of a tall man with long, wild hair clearly projected on the window. When I returned, I told everyone what I had seen. That's when they confirmed what I had heard before. They said my grandmother's father continued to return, searching for his daughter. In the family, some believe it, others don't. There are those who say they've seen him, and there are those who, like me, have had unexplainable encounters. But one thing is certain. Nobody, absolutely nobody, spends Thanksgiving in that house. Since then, I've found myself wondering what would happen if someone did stay. Would they simply hear the coughing? Or would they finally come face to face with the man who refused to rest? I don't think any of us is brave enough to find out. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about that note. Those words written in shaky handwriting. I'll visit you every Thanksgiving, ungrateful daughter. And I wonder if, when my time comes, I'll be able to rest peacefully. Or if, like my great-grandfather, there will be something that keeps me tethered to this world, unable to let go of old grievances. The rational part of me wants to dismiss it all as superstition. But then I remember that shadow on the window, too tall and too strange to belong to any living person. And I know deep down that some promises outlive even those who make them. It was Diwali Eve of 2008, and I was 10 years old. My family had moved to Seattle from Mumbai just 3 years prior, and while we embraced many American customs, we still celebrated our Hindu traditions faithfully. Diwali, the Festival of Lights, was always our most special holiday, a time when homes are illuminated with diyas and families gather to celebrate together. That particular Diwali Eve, however, felt unusually quiet and tense. My father, who worked as a trauma surgeon at Harborview Medical Center, often volunteered for holiday shifts, since many of his American colleagues wanted time off for Christmas and Thanksgiving. That night, he was working a double shift, leaving my little sister Priya and me at home. Technically, our mother was there too, but she had been battling severe depression for months following my grandmother's death. The medication she took often left her in a deep sleep, virtually impossible to wake once night fell. It's difficult to discuss, but this detail is critical to what happened that night. Priya and I were downstairs watching a Bollywood movie, and we heard an unusual knocking pattern on our front door. As the older sibling, I felt responsible and went to check who it was. Our door had a small peephole that allowed me to see outside, and through it, I saw a man dressed as Santa Claus standing on our porch, holding a large red sack. He smiled when he noticed movement at the peephole and gestured for me to come closer. I found this deeply strange. Why would someone dressed as Santa Claus be knocking on our door during Diwali? "Hello there, young man," he said in an overly cheerful voice that somehow felt wrong. "I'm Santa Claus. Open the door and I'll give you your Christmas presents early this year." I immediately replied that we didn't celebrate Christmas. We were Hindu and celebrated Diwali instead. "Of course you do," he responded with an unsettling enthusiasm. "I've decided to visit all children this year, not just Christian ones. Don't you want presents? All children want presents." I remained suspicious and informed him that Hindu children already receive gifts during Diwali, not from Santa, but from family members. The smile vanished from his face instantly, and his expression transformed completely. He began insisting, demanding that I unlock the door. His voice dropped to a threatening growl that made my skin crawl. Frightened, I told Priya to call 911. Upon hearing this, the man quickly turned and disappeared down our driveway, vanishing into the foggy night. When we reached emergency services, the dispatcher seemed uninterested in our predicament. Thinking back, she probably assumed we were excitable children, making up stories about Santa Claus. Before disconnecting, she sternly warned us that the number was only for genuine emergencies. Priya and I were terrified. We were just two children, 10 and 7 years old, with no idea how to handle such a situation. We didn't know any other emergency numbers, and this was 2008, before everyone had smartphones. My father didn't carry a personal cell phone during hospital shifts, and I had no clue how to reach the hospital directly. Our mother remained completely unconscious upstairs, despite Priya's desperate attempts to wake her. We were utterly alone. Not long after, the man returned and began pounding on the door. "I know the police aren't coming," he shouted, his voice filled with malice. "Open this door right now, or you'll regret it." Priya, panic-stricken, ran upstairs again to try desperately to wake our mother. Not knowing what else to do, I made a decision that, to my childish mind, seemed perfectly logical. I grabbed several of our Diwali oil lamps, lit them all, and held them directly beneath our smoke detector. Then I quickly extinguished the flames, generating enough smoke to trigger the alarm. Looking back as an adult, I realize how dangerous my actions were. I could have easily set our house ablaze. But in my 10-year-old mind, all I knew was that fire alarms automatically summoned emergency services and would bring help to our house. Fortunately, there was a fire station less than 5 minutes away, so they arrived quickly. Priya came running downstairs, frightened by the blaring alarm. But I reassured her there was no actual fire, and that we needed to stay together inside the house. To my horror, the man was still outside. Worse still, he approached the firefighters as they arrived, pretending to be relieved by their presence. I remember hearing him tell them he was our father, and had dressed as Santa to surprise us with early Christmas gifts. He spun an elaborate tale about his costume not having pockets for his house keys, and being locked out when he heard the alarm go off. He then pleaded with the firefighters to break down the door so he could rescue us from the supposed fire. Incredibly, the firefighters seemed to believe him and began preparing to force entry. They called for us to stand back from the door, but Priya and I panicked. We began crying and screaming, explaining that this man was not our father, that our real father was working at the hospital, and that we didn't even know this person. We emphasized that we were Hindu and celebrating Diwali, not Christmas, making it clear that something was very wrong. One of the firefighters paused and listened carefully to us. "You don't celebrate Christmas?" he asked, looking confused. "No, we're Hindu," I said through tears, pointing to the tilak on my forehead and showing him our Diwali lamps that were still warm from being recently lit. Sobbing, I explained that I had triggered the alarm because the police didn't believe us and we needed help desperately. I begged him not to let the man inside. To our immense relief, the firefighter believed me. He looked at the man suspiciously and asked why Santa would appear at a Hindu household during Diwali. I don't remember exactly what the man said in response, but it was clear the firefighters no longer trusted his story. 2 of them quickly restrained him, while another called the police. One firefighter also asked for the name of the hospital where my father worked, so they could contact him about the incident. Shortly afterward, police arrived and arrested the man. An officer stayed with us until my father rushed home. When he understood what had transpired, my father was simultaneously furious about our mother's condition and overwhelmingly relieved that we were safe. The following year, we celebrated Diwali with extra fervor. The warm glow of our diyas had never felt so comforting. I've never been more grateful for a peaceful, uneventful holiday. To this day, I believe some divine protection was watching over us that night. Had we opened the door to that Santa, there's a strong possibility that would have been our last Diwali celebration. Later we learned that the man had been targeting homes where he suspected children might be alone or vulnerable during holidays. The police found rope, duct tape, and a knife in his gift sack. Since that night, I've never taken safety for granted, and I always check through the peephole twice before opening any door. This Christmas Eve memory is one of the most vivid moments from my childhood. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood in rural Vermont, in a typical middle-class farmhouse that my parents had lovingly restored. My sister and I were absolutely enchanted by Christmas. The magic of it consumed our thoughts for weeks leading up to the big day. I was about 7 years old when this incident happened, shortly after we had moved into our renovated home. The experience remains etched in my memory because of the intensity of what occurred that Christmas Eve night. As usual, excitement made it impossible for me to sleep. Even as a young child, I struggled with insomnia whenever something thrilling was on the horizon. That evening, I had been playing on my grandfather's old ham radio that he'd set up in my bedroom, listening to distant stations until exhaustion would finally overcome me. That particular night, I was tuning into broadcasts from Canada when I felt the need to use the bathroom. I turned down the radio's volume and crept silently through the hallway, trying to avoid being caught awake by my mother, who would certainly have been furious given the late hour. After using the bathroom on the second floor, I tiptoed back toward my bedroom when I detected a sound coming from downstairs. The subtle rustling of our Christmas tree ornaments. My first innocent reaction was to believe it must be Santa Claus himself. Excited and curious, I began descending the creaky wooden stairs on tiptoe, trying desperately not to make any noise. As I approached the bottom of the staircase, the sound of tinkling glass ornaments became more distinct. The living room was almost completely dark, except for the glow of a flashlight that someone was holding. I peered around the corner from the base of the stairs, and to my surprise, saw the legs of an adult crouched behind our tree. On the floor beside him was a canvas duffel bag with what looked like a red stripe along its side. For a moment, I stood frozen, trying to process what I was witnessing. The man emerged from behind the tree, and upon noticing my presence, put his finger to his lips in a gesture of silence. He whispered, "Yes, I am Santa Claus," with a slight accent I couldn't place. In that instant, I knew he wasn't who he claimed to be. Even with my limited life experience, logic prevailed over fantasy. Without thinking twice, I began screaming frantically for my parents. My reaction visibly startled him. He hesitated momentarily, seemingly deciding whether to grab his bag with our treasures or flee empty-handed. Finally, he abandoned everything and rushed toward the side door that led to our wraparound porch. I don't recall if the door was unlocked, but I vividly remember the sound of his boots crunching through the fresh snow as he escaped. Mere seconds later, my parents came rushing downstairs, my father clutching an antique shotgun that had belonged to my great-grandfather. "There was a man here," I shouted repeatedly. They discovered the abandoned canvas duffel bag on the floor, filled with presents he had intended to steal, along with several family heirlooms that had been displayed on the mantel, including my grandmother's silver music box that played Silent Night. From this point forward, my memory becomes somewhat foggy, so I later asked my parents about what happened afterward. My father explained that he had run outside in just his thermal underwear and boots, prepared to confront the intruder despite the bitter cold and falling snow. The Christmas tree was partially dismantled, with several sentimental ornaments, some dating back 3 generations, stuffed inside the bag. Who in their right mind would steal Christmas decorations? My mother had wondered aloud. According to my father, the man had forced open the cellar door using what appeared to be a crowbar, The wooden frame was splintered and marked. We discovered later that another house about a mile down our country road had also been broken into that very same night. The incident made the front page of our small town's weekly newspaper, complete with a blurry security camera image from our neighbor's property. Most likely it was the same person, described as wearing a dark coat with a distinctive red scarf. There are few memories from my childhood that remain as crystal clear as this one. Even after all these years, I can relive each detail as if it happened yesterday. The cold draft from the open cellar door, the smell of pine needles mixed with the intruder's unfamiliar cologne, and the peculiar silence that fell over our home after he fled into the snowy darkness. On Christmas Eve of 2015, I was 22 years old and working at Morgan's Pharmacy in a small town in Maine. My closing shift fell precisely on this night, leaving me alone in the store until midnight. The idea of quitting had crossed my mind, but my parents strongly advised against it. The pharmacy was nestled about 5 miles from my house, at the end of a winding road that branched off the main highway. During daylight hours, business was steady enough to justify keeping the doors open, but after 8 in the evening, customers were scarce. On that particular Christmas Eve, I expected absolutely no one to come in after that hour. My shift began at 4 in the afternoon, and to my surprise, the first few hours were bustling with last-minute shoppers picking up prescriptions and gifts. But as I had anticipated, customer traffic dwindled significantly after 8. The pharmacy was scheduled to close at 11 that special night, which meant I'd be alone at the register for those final 3 long hours. To make matters worse, Emma, my coworker whom I secretly had feelings for, would be leaving early to attend a family dinner. We spent a good amount of time chatting while the store was quiet, and watching her leave made me feel even more isolated in the increasingly silent building. When the clock struck 10, I could barely wait to finish my shift. I had served only 2 customers during the previous hour, and was the only person in the store. The holiday music that had been playing softly through the speakers was starting to get on my nerves, the cheerful melodies contrasting eerily with the empty aisles. That's when I heard a peculiar sound coming from the window, something that sounded like the accidental scraping of metal against glass. I looked toward the noise and noticed a man standing outside. He wore a thick jacket with a hood pulled low over his face, baggy pants, and dark, heavy boots. I stood frozen, watching until he realized I was staring at him. Without hesitation, he walked to the entrance and came into the store. As he passed by me, he fixed me with an unblinking stare that made my skin crawl, then continued down one of the aisles, disappearing between the shelves of medications. Several minutes later, I began to hear a tapping sound. The noise was coming from somewhere inside the store, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly where. I moved to the right corner of the counter, trying to peek down the aisle, but it appeared empty. The tapping was so rhythmic and deliberate that there was no doubt he was making it. Yet I couldn't determine his exact location. That's when I realized I desperately needed to use the bathroom. But there was a problem. Store policy strictly prohibited leaving the register unattended while customers were in the store. Time crawled by, perhaps 10 minutes passed, and I still hadn't seen the man again. However, the tapping continued to echo intermittently throughout the store. Finally, my patience wore thin. I decided to step out from behind the counter and called out, "Excuse me, sir. We're closing soon." I walked through the aisles trying to locate him, but there was no sign of the man anywhere. Strangely, each aisle I entered seemed to transfer the noises to the next one. In the candy aisle, I heard what sounded like jingle bells, as if someone was deliberately shaking them to taunt me. I approached one of the shelves and peered through the small holes between products, trying to catch a glimpse of anything unusual. That's when I saw something that made my blood freeze. On the other side of the shelf, two eyes were staring fixedly at me through the tiny gaps. Before I could react, the eyes vanished, and the tall man appeared in the aisle where I was standing. He began making strange sounds that resembled childish giggles or the noises of someone mentally unstable. His movements were unsettling. He laughed and advanced toward me, bouncing on his tiptoes. It might sound ridiculous described like this, but the scene was so macabre, and the way he approached was so swift that at that moment I feared for my life. I instinctively backed away, while he continued following me with those bizarre hops. My only thought was to get to the front of the store and call my manager or the police. However, when I glanced back, I saw that he had stopped at the end of the first aisle, about 20 feet away. What had been a strange, childish smile on his face was replaced by a dark, angry expression filled with pure malice. That was my breaking point. Without thinking twice, I bolted out the front door. To my horror, he started running after me. Gone were the weird hops. Now he was running with determination, as if he was intent on catching me at any cost. My mind screamed at me to run to my car, but the fear of him catching me before I could lock the doors was paralyzing. Instead, I decided to run behind the building and entered through the back door, which was still unlocked. I quickly secured it, not knowing if he was still following me or if he had remained outside. Without stopping to think, I went straight to the main entrance of the store and locked the front door as well. I grabbed the phone at the counter and called my manager, who fortunately answered. I explained what was happening, saying I needed to leave immediately because someone dangerous was after me. But while I was speaking, something caught my attention, a sound. It was coming from inside the store. It was that same tapping noise I had heard before, echoing from one of the aisles. I dropped the phone instantly, overcome by a mixture of panic and adrenaline, and ran to my car. In less than 30 seconds, I was driving away from there. I never returned to that pharmacy. When I got home, I called my manager again, who then contacted the police. According to what a friend told me later, nothing was stolen that night, something that puzzles me to this day. My manager, as expected, was far from pleased that I had left the store in that manner, and we never spoke again. The next day, I tried my best to enjoy Christmas normally, though the events of the previous night remained etched in my mind. What disturbs me most wasn't just the man's behavior, but the fact that when I locked both doors, front and back, he somehow was still inside. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress of working alone on Christmas Eve had gotten to me. But then I remember those eyes staring through the shelf, that childish giggle transforming into something sinister, and I know what I experienced was real. I've never worked retail during the holidays again, And to this day, whenever I hear tapping sounds at night, I freeze, half expecting to see that hooded figure bouncing toward me on his tiptoes, with that terrible smile stretching across his face. It was the first week of July 2019 when my partner Charlotte and I decided to escape the city heat. We had reserved a lakeside cabin through Vacasa that looked absolutely perfect, rustic, yet modern, sitting on the shores of Lake Champlain in Vermont. The property was decorated with a charming summer theme, featuring string lights along the deck railing, colorful Adirondack chairs facing the water, and wildflower gardens surrounding the pathway. The grounds were spacious, and the house was located near a quaint village that promised fresh farmers markets and local craft shops. The setting promised to become even more magical, since perfect weather was forecast for our stay, warm days, with gentle breezes and clear, starry nights. We left Boston early that Friday morning to ensure we'd have enough time for grocery shopping and settling in before sunset. The drive to northern Vermont took about 5 hours, and the journey was pleasant. We made a stop at a local co-op market to buy fresh produce, local cheeses, craft beers, and some homemade pastries before heading directly to our destination. The final stretch of our journey took us down a winding gravel road that meandered through dense maple forests before opening up to reveal the lakefront property. The cabin, surrounded by tall pines and birch trees, had a wraparound porch with a wood-fired hot tub overlooking the water, something that seemed perfect for evenings under the stars. The exterior was adorned with twinkling fairy lights strung between trees, colorful garden lanterns lining the stone path, and a collection of vibrant potted flowers arranged near the entrance. We made several trips between the car and the house to unload everything. The first impression confirmed our expectations. It was a comfortable place, just as shown in the photos. In the corner of the living room stood a handcrafted wooden bookcase filled with local guidebooks and novels. The walls were decorated with landscape paintings by local artists and several intricate dream catchers that swayed gently with the breeze coming through the open windows. The subtle scent of cedar and pine gave it that special touch you'd expect from a cabin, though the house was actually more modern and well-appointed than rustic. In one corner of the living room, a stack of firewood was positioned next to a large stone fireplace that dominated the wall. The cabin had 3 bedrooms, but we only needed one. We left our bags in the master bedroom, and as usual, I went exploring. I checked the refrigerator, tested the television to see what streaming services were available, and peered through the various windows. On the upper level, there was a loft with a pool table and some board games, and in the basement, I went down to see. It was a larger space than I had imagined, considering the cozy appearance of the property above. The basement was somewhat uninviting, dark and cool, with the feel of a workshop and laundry area. While I was down there, I heard a knock at the front door. I quickly came upstairs and found a man appearing to be in his mid-30s, wearing khaki shorts and a faded blue and green plaid shirt. He flashed a broad smile and said, "Everything all right in there?" I replied that yes, everything was fine, and asked if he was responsible for the Vacasa property. He explained that he looked after the place, along with his brother. I asked his name, and he introduced himself as Jake. He mentioned that he lived just up the hill in the neighboring house, and that we could call him if we needed anything. I thanked him and he left. I found it curious that he seemed to know I was with my girlfriend, since Charlotte hadn't come to the door. Perhaps his brother, Daniel, who I had communicated with during the booking process, had mentioned something about us. I had commented during our exchange that we were looking for a peaceful lakeside retreat. It was early evening now. The sun was beginning to set over the lake, casting long golden reflections across the water. We turned on some soft music to fill the space while we prepared dinner: grilled salmon, fresh asparagus, wild rice, and crusty sourdough bread. A feast worthy of our vacation setting. We ate on the deck, with the string lights twinkling overhead, creating a magical atmosphere as twilight deepened around us. After dinner, we opened a bottle of local wine and put on a classic summer movie, The Way Back. One of the few decent summer-themed films we could find on the streaming service. In case it wasn't clear, we're really into seasonal experiences, embracing whatever time of year it is. After watching the movie and giving the food time to settle, we decided to try out the wood-fired hot tub on the deck. Before that, I lit all the lanterns and string lights in the yard. Sitting in the hot tub, watching fireflies dance in the darkness and the stars reflecting on the lake's surface, the moment seemed perfect, almost surreal. Until suddenly, the crackling of the fire beneath the tub seemed to diminish, and the water began cooling rapidly. The resulting silence revealed something unexpected: the clear sound of footsteps around the property. Charlotte and I exchanged worried glances. I whispered, "Should I call out to see who's there?" "No, don't even think about it," she replied urgently. The footsteps gradually faded away until they disappeared completely. I tried to reassure her, suggesting it might be a deer wandering around, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Those footsteps had the unmistakable weight and rhythm of a person. After that unsettling experience, we went back inside to shower before bed. However, the hot water lasted less than 3 minutes before turning ice cold. As soon as it became freezing, we both yelped and jumped out of the shower. I grabbed my phone and sent a message to Daniel, the host, reporting the problem. He responded about half an hour later, saying it was strange, and that he would send someone to check the water heater the next day. We ended up going to sleep after that improvised cold shower. In the middle of the night, we were awakened by loud knocking at the front door. Charlotte, terrified, shook me awake. "I'll go see who it is," I mumbled. "No, stay here and don't make any noise," she insisted. In truth, I was relieved she said that. The last thing I wanted was to confront whoever was making that sound in the middle of the night. The knocking came in 3 series, loud and aggressive, before ceasing completely. We remained motionless, nervously whispering to each other. I got up, went to the bedroom door, and locked it, as if that would protect us. The minutes dragged on until, after about 30 minutes of absolute silence, we managed to fall asleep again. In the morning, I sent another message to Daniel reporting what had happened. He seemed as confused as we were, saying it was really strange and that if it happened again, we should call the police. It wasn't exactly a reassuring response, but it made sense. What else could he suggest? Something like, "Stay armed and shoot anyone who appears at the door." Despite the discomfort, I didn't want to press the issue and seemed difficult. Outside, the scenery was idyllic. The lake was mirror calm, reflecting the surrounding trees and mountains under a bright blue sky. I went out to inspect the hot tub and noticed footprints around the cabin. I thought about the knocking from the night before and wondered if they belonged to the same person. However, these tracks seemed fresh, and with the heavy dew that had fallen overnight, any footprints from yesterday should have been less defined. It was then that I heard footsteps approaching from behind me. It was Jake, emerging from the path that led down from the neighboring property. I explained the hot water problem and mentioned that Daniel had promised to send someone. He confirmed that he knew about the issue and was there specifically to check the water heater. I took the opportunity to comment on the knocking at the door and the footprints around the property. I even showed him the marks. Jake looked at them carefully and said, "There are some strange folks around here who like to wander at night." I asked if we should avoid using the hot tub in the evening. "No need to worry. The people around here are harmless," he replied confidently. Jake entered the house without hesitation, made a brief inspection, and went down to the basement, saying he would check the water heater. He had an odd manner that was difficult to ignore. I decided to send a message to Daniel, letting him know that Jake was there solving the problem. Daniel's response left me cold. "Jake." "Who's Jake?" Confused, I immediately replied, "Your brother, the one who manages the Vacasa property with you." But Daniel's response was even more disturbing. "What are you talking about? I don't have a brother." It felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. The realization hit me hard. I wrote again, trying to confirm. "You don't have a brother named Jake who helps take care of the property with you." Daniel categorically denied it and asked me who this person was. I ran to Charlotte, trying not to panic, and whispered that we needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I asked her to pack everything silently. Within minutes, we threw our belongings into the car without worrying about being organized. I'm sure we forgot something, maybe a charger or some small item, but that was irrelevant at that moment. As soon as I got into the SUV and started the engine, I looked in the rearview mirror and my heart nearly stopped. Jake was coming toward us, walking rapidly toward the back of the car. I didn't think twice. I shifted into gear and accelerated, leaving the property behind as fast as I could. Once on the main road, still trembling, we called Daniel and explained everything, insisting that he call the police immediately. The call was brief, but about 20 minutes later, while we were still driving around the area trying to calm ourselves, Daniel called us back. He said the police had arrived at the house, but found no one there. He was also on his way to the property and wanted more details about what had happened. After a few hours wandering around the area to recover our nerves, we decided to head back to Boston. Later that same night, Daniel sent another message apologizing for the incident. He emphasized that he didn't know anyone matching Jake's description and had no idea who it could be. What bothers me most about this whole experience is thinking that this man was watching us the entire time. From the moment we arrived until we were in the hot tub, he was nearby throughout, and it was probably him who knocked on the door during the night. I can't even imagine what his intentions were. I only know that leaving quickly was the best decision we could have made. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear knocking at my door. and every time I consider booking a remote cabin for a vacation, I remember those footsteps circling around us in the darkness, and I choose a busy hotel instead. It was October of 2018 when everything happened. My wife and I were living in a craftsman-style house we'd purchased together in a small New England town. It was a charming neighborhood with towering maple trees that blazed with color in the fall. Exactly the kind of place where you'd want to raise children. That's what made what happened 3 years ago all the more disturbing. We knew our immediate neighbors fairly well. The elderly couple to our left, the young family across the street, and Richard, the man who lived alone in the Victorian house to our right. They were all pleasant in that distinctly New England way, friendly but respectful of privacy. But as I've come to learn, you never truly know what darkness someone might be harboring behind closed doors. Richard was always cordial when we crossed paths, though he kept to himself. He was somewhere in his late 30s, with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of face you'd forget minutes after seeing it. I'd occasionally spot him coming or going, presumably to his job, though I never knew what he did for a living. He was just Richard from next door, unremarkable in every way. That autumn, I realized I hadn't seen Richard for about a week. His navy blue Volvo remained parked in the driveway, which wasn't necessarily concerning. The fall chill had set in early that year, and most houses on our street, including Richard's, were already decorated with Halloween displays. I always found it curious how he, a single man approaching 40, took such pride in his elaborate decorations. His front yard featured an impressive array of carved pumpkins that were illuminated by string lights wrapped around his porch railings and columns. One evening, while raking leaves in our front yard, I noticed something odd about Richard's Halloween lights. They were flickering erratically, not in the intentional spooky pattern you might expect for the season, but in a disjointed, frantic way that suggested an electrical malfunction. It wasn't just one section. The entire display was blinking chaotically. The next morning, as I left for work, I observed that Richard's car was still in the driveway, and all the blinds in his house remained drawn. When I returned that evening, nothing had changed, except the Halloween lights were on again. I mentioned to my wife, half-jokingly, that Richard must be in some kind of seasonal hibernation. Later that night, my wife came into our living room with a concerned look. "Those lights at Richard's are flickering wildly again," she said. I went to our front window to see for myself. Sure enough, the lights were pulsing erratically, just as they had the night before. The pattern seemed too irregular to be intentional, more like a cry for help than a festive display. I decided to walk over and let him know, while also checking if everything was all right, since I hadn't seen him in some time. I knocked on his door. No answer. I rang the doorbell and waited, but there was no response. With all the blinds closed tight, I couldn't tell if any lights were on inside. I pressed the doorbell a second time, and finally I heard movement. Richard opened the door just enough to show his face. He looked disheveled, unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes. I explained about the flickering lights, but as I spoke, I realized they had suddenly stopped. He thanked me with a tight smile and said he hadn't noticed anything unusual. I asked if he was feeling okay, since I hadn't seen him around lately. He replied that he'd been under the weather, but there was something off about him. He seemed jumpy, his eyes darting past me to scan the street. That's when I heard it, a sound from inside the house. For a moment, I thought my imagination was playing tricks on me. But no, it was unmistakable. A muffled cry that sounded like a child calling for help. Richard had no children. He lived alone. My blood ran cold, but I managed to keep my expression neutral, simply nodding and saying I hoped he'd feel better soon. As soon as I was back in my house, I turned to my wife and said, "Call the police right now. I think Richard has a child in there." She looked at me in disbelief. "What did you just say?" I repeated. "I think Richard has kidnapped a child." I decided to make the call myself. I reported what I'd heard to the police dispatcher. What sounded like a child's cry coming from my neighbor's house, a man who lived alone and hadn't been seen outside for at least a week or two. I requested that my name be kept confidential, though I knew Richard would likely figure out I was the one who called. Within 30 minutes, police officers arrived. They entered Richard's house with an emergency warrant, and what they discovered was horrifying. In a hidden room beneath the stairs, they found a girl no more than 9 years old. She had been there for 6 days, taken from a town nearly 200 miles away. As for the flickering Halloween lights, the little girl had ingeniously found a way to manipulate the electrical connection from inside her prison. It was her desperate attempt to signal anyone who might be passing by. Perhaps each time she spotted someone through a tiny crack in the wall, she tried to send her message. When she saw me outside, she must have seized the opportunity to cry for help. The intelligence and survival instinct of that child astounds me to this day. I was relieved to learn that she was reunited with her family. I can't begin to imagine the trauma she endured in that house, but I pray with all my heart that she finds healing and happiness as she grows up. Based on the severity of his crimes, Richard won't see freedom for decades, if ever. Sometimes when I look at our once peaceful neighborhood, I'm reminded that evil can hide in the most ordinary places, behind the most unremarkable faces. And sometimes, salvation comes in the simple form of flickering lights that someone chooses not to ignore. I was enjoying a quiet weekend alone at my cabin in the Vermont woods when my girlfriend Ellie decided to surprise me with a visit. It was the middle of October, and the fall colors were at their peak, creating a picturesque but somewhat eerie atmosphere around the isolated property. Ellie suggested we have a horror movie marathon that evening to embrace the Halloween spirit. We ordered pizza from the only place that delivered this far out, opened a bottle of whiskey, and settled in front of the fireplace. We started with the Blair Witch Project, and then queued up Hereditary for our second feature. When we finished the whiskey, I decided to make a quick trip to the small liquor store about 3 miles down the mountain road. It would be a quick drive, no more than 20 minutes round trip. Despite it being almost 9 in the evening, the store would still be open since it was Friday, and the owner always stayed late for weekend customers. When I arrived, I found Tom, the same clerk who'd been running the place for decades. As usual, we fell into easy conversation about the upcoming winter season and whether we'd get an early snow. In the middle of our chat, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. It was Ellie. I excused myself. "One moment, please," I said to Tom. When I answered, I could tell immediately that something was wrong. Ellie's voice was tight with tension. As she explained, she was hearing strange noises coming from beneath the floor, specifically from the crawl space under the cabin. "Stay calm, it's probably nothing," I tried to reassure her. But Ellie insisted I stay on the phone with her until I got back. I agreed and started driving immediately, maintaining our conversation while she remained frozen on the couch with the movie paused, listening intently for any sound. "Have you heard anything else?" I asked as I navigated the winding road. "No, but what if there's some animal down there?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. "That's impossible. The crawl space is completely sealed from the outside," I guaranteed, though in truth, I couldn't be entirely certain. The cabin had been in my family for 3 generations, and I'd never fully inspected every corner of the foundation. Back at the cabin, I opened the new bottle of whiskey, and we tried to resume watching the movie. Not 15 minutes later, we both heard it, a dull thud, like something heavy shifting underneath us. I looked at Ellie, who returned my gaze with wide eyes. Something was definitely down there. "Maybe it is some animal after all," I admitted. We paused the movie again. I went to the utility closet where the access hatch to the crawl space was located, grabbed a flashlight, and descended the rickety wooden ladder. The beam of light cut through the dusty darkness, revealing stacks of old furniture and boxes that had accumulated over the years. Any small creature could easily hide among them. The unmistakable smell of urine confirmed that something had indeed taken residence there. This wasn't my area of expertise, so I texted my cousin, who lived about an hour away, asking if he knew any pest control companies that serviced properties this remote. As I was climbing back up the ladder, I heard movement from the far corner of the crawl space, something much larger than a raccoon or possum. My heart raced at the thought of a bear or something equally dangerous lunging toward me. I scrambled up the remaining rungs, slammed the hatch shut, and secured the lock. There was nothing more we could do tonight, except try to enjoy the rest of our evening. After Hereditary ended, we went to bed, both of us trying to convince ourselves it was just some woodland creature seeking shelter. I woke sometime around 3 in the morning with a splitting headache and a full bladder. I opened the bedroom door and peered down the dark hallway. At the end of it, illuminated only by the faint moonlight streaming through a window, I saw the silhouette of a person. My instinct was to close the door slowly and lock it. Moments later, I heard footsteps approaching and the doorknob turning. Someone was trying to get in. Then a hoarse, deep voice spoke from the other side. "I know you're awake." Ellie began screaming, awakened by the noise and my panicked reaction. I couldn't say anything to calm her, because terror had paralyzed me. On the other side of the door, I heard footsteps retreating. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The wait for the sheriff's deputy to arrive felt eternal, as if time itself had stopped. When 2 officers finally entered the cabin, there was no sign of anybody. Whoever had been there was gone. But something confirmed my suspicions had been correct. The smell of urine in the crawl space wasn't my imagination. There was literally a makeshift bed set up, indicating someone had probably been hiding there for quite some time. Empty food wrappers and water bottles suggested they'd been living under my cabin for days, maybe weeks. Everything pointed to someone who had been watching the cabin, waiting for an opportunity. The deputies suggested it might be a fugitive hiding from the law, as there had been a prison break at the county facility, about 70 miles away 3 weeks earlier. This information didn't make the experience any less terrifying. When I told my family about it later, they were skeptical at first, until the sheriff's department confirmed they found fingerprints matching one of the escaped inmates. They never caught the person, and to this day, I still wonder if they're out there somewhere. Since that night, I've never failed to check that every door and window is locked before going to sleep. And I've installed motion sensor floodlights around the entire perimeter of the cabin. The crawlspace now has a reinforced door with 3 separate locks. Sometimes when I'm alone at the cabin and the wind howls through the trees, I still find myself listening for sounds coming from below, wondering if someone is watching, waiting for me to let my guard down again. I was 22 and had just moved to Montana after landing my first job with a wildlife conservation group. The mountains around Blackwater County were breathtaking, jagged peaks that seemed to tear at the sky, dense pine forests, and valleys that stretched into forever. With 3 weeks before my official start date, I figured I'd get to know the wilderness that would become my office. On a crisp autumn morning, I decided to hike Shadow Ridge Trail. According to the weathered information board at the trailhead, it was a moderate 5-mile loop that wound through old-growth forest before circling back. Perfect for a half-day excursion. I packed light, just a small backpack with a couple water bottles, some trail mix, and my analog camera. I'd purposely left my phone in the car, wanting to disconnect completely and enjoy the solitude. The parking area was empty, except for a mud-splattered pickup truck parked near the entrance. Judging by the layer of dust on its windshield, it had been there for at least a day or 2. I remember thinking it was strange that someone would leave their vehicle for so long at such a remote trailhead. But Montana was full of serious backpackers who disappeared into the wilderness for days at a time. The trail started gently enough, winding between towering ponderosa pines. The morning light filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. The air was cool and carried the scent of pine needles and damp earth. It was exactly the escape I'd been hoping for. I'd been hiking for about 45 minutes when I saw him, a man sitting on a fallen log just off the trail. He was in his 50s, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His clothes were well worn but practical. Canvas pants, a faded flannel shirt, and sturdy hiking boots caked with mud. A walking stick rested against the log beside him. He nodded as I approached, and I returned the gesture with a smile. There was something about him that seemed perfectly at home in these woods, like he was just another fixture of the landscape. I assumed he was heading back to the trailhead, since he looked like he'd been out for quite some time. His clothes were dirty and sweat-stained around the collar. I continued past him, losing myself in the rhythm of the hike and the sounds of the forest. The trail began to climb, switchbacking up a ridge that offered glimpses of the valley below. I remember stopping to take a photograph of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead when I heard a shout behind me. Turning around, I saw the same man from earlier jogging up the trail, waving his arm to get my attention. I waited, curious about what could be so urgent. "Shadow Ridge?" he asked between slightly labored breaths, pointing at the trail ahead. I nodded. "That's what I'm following, yeah." He shook his head and gestured to a narrow path branching off to the left that I hadn't noticed before. "That's Shadow Ridge. This here's an old maintenance trail that loops around to nowhere. Folks get turned around here all the time." He had a slight accent I couldn't quite place, something vaguely Midwestern, but worn smooth by years away. "Oh," I said, genuinely grateful. "Thanks for catching me. I didn't even see that turn." "No problem," he replied with an easy smile. "I've been hiking these mountains for 17 years. Hate hearing about tourists getting lost because of poor trail markings." He gestured toward the correct path. "You heading up to the overlook?" I nodded, and he fell into step beside me as we took the left fork. "I'm headed that way myself. Don't mind the company, do you?" What could I say? He just saved me from potentially getting lost, and he seemed harmless enough, just an experienced local hiker. So I said I didn't mind, though truthfully, I had been looking forward to solitude. As we walked, he told me he lived in a cabin not far from the trailhead and hiked these trails almost daily. He pointed out things I would have missed: a woodpecker's nest high in a dead tree, tracks of a mountain lion that had crossed the path recently, a cluster of mushrooms that were either mighty fine eating or your last meal, depending on whether you knew what you were doing. After about 20 minutes, our conversation gradually tapered off into a slightly uncomfortable silence. He walked slightly behind me now, and I could feel his eyes on my back. The trail had narrowed considerably, with dense undergrowth pressing in from both sides. Something felt off, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. We'd been hiking for over an hour when I realized the trail should have started looping back toward the parking lot by now. The 5-mile loop I'd planned to take shouldn't have gone this deep into the mountains. I was about to mention this when my boot caught on something metal half buried in the trail. I looked down and saw a rusted steel rail emerging from the dirt. My eyes followed it forward to where the narrow trail opened into a small clearing. There, cut into the side of the mountain, was the entrance to an old mine shaft. Rotting timber supports framed a dark opening, about 6 feet high. The rusted rails ran straight into that darkness. Curious, I approached the entrance and peered inside. The daylight penetrated only a few feet before being swallowed by absolute darkness. A cold draft emerged from the opening, carrying a musty, metallic smell. "Interesting," I said, mostly to myself. This wasn't mentioned on any of the trail guides. When there was no response, I turned around and found the man standing much closer than I expected, barely 6 feet away. The friendly expression was gone from his face, replaced by something blank and watchful. His eyes looked different somehow, flatter, like those of a snake. "Go inside," he said. His voice had changed too. The conversational tone was gone, replaced by something cold and commanding. "It's been waiting for you." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft from the mine. "What's been waiting?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as I casually shifted my position to create more distance between us. "It gets so hungry," he continued as if I hadn't spoken. "So many years between visitors. But it can smell you now." He took a step toward me, reaching into his pocket and pulling out something that glinted in the dappled sunlight, a hunting knife with a worn wooden handle. Pure instinct took over. I bolted, darting around him and back down the trail. I expected to hear footsteps behind me, to feel a hand grabbing at my jacket or worse. But after the initial sounds of pursuit, there was nothing. I risked a glance back after about 50 yards and saw something that made me run even faster. The man wasn't chasing me. He was standing at the mine entrance, perfectly still, watching me flee. And then, as I watched, he turned and walked into the darkness of the mine, disappearing completely. I ran until my lungs burned, following the trail back the way we had come. When I reached the fork where he'd first corrected my path, I took the right trail this time, the one he'd claimed was wrong. Within 30 minutes, I was back at the parking lot. The pickup truck was gone. Later that evening, after I'd calmed down enough to think clearly, I reported the incident to the local sheriff's office. The deputy listened politely, but didn't seem particularly concerned until I mentioned the mine. "There aren't any old mines along Shadow Ridge," he said, frowning. "You sure about where this happened?" When I insisted, he pulled out a Forest Service map of the area and asked me to show him. I traced our route as best I could remember. The deputy's expression changed. "This area here," he said, tapping the spot where I believed the mine to be, "is what locals call the dead zone. There was a mining operation there back in the 1880s. Collapsed after a flash flood in 1903. Killed 27 miners." He leaned back in his chair. "There have been stories about that place for generations. Hikers claiming they met a friendly guide who tried to lead them to the old mine entrance. Always describes himself as a local who's been there for years." "Has anyone ever followed him in?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. The deputy's face was grim. 3 hikers disappeared in that area in 1976. Search parties found their gear scattered around that old mine entrance, but no bodies were ever recovered. He gave me a long look. "The thing is, the mine entrance itself shouldn't exist anymore. It was dynamited and sealed by the Forest Service in 1958. I never hiked Shadow Ridge again. I stayed with the conservation group for 2 years, but I stuck to team expeditions and well-traveled routes. Sometimes at night, I still dream about that mine entrance and what might be waiting inside it, hungry after all these years. And sometimes, when I'm in a crowded place and catch a certain expression on a stranger's face, that flat, watchful look, I remember the man on the trail and wonder how many others like him are out there, waiting to guide lost hikers home." In the winter of 1997, I was living alone in a small cabin nestled deep in the mountains of Montana. My nearest neighbor was about 2 miles down the winding dirt road, and visitors were rare, unless someone had gotten terribly lost, or the occasional delivery driver braved the journey. The isolation suited me just fine. I'd moved there specifically to work on my novel without distractions. That particular evening in late January, I was returning home after spending the day at the local library in town, arriving just after 8. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a light snow had begun to fall, creating a peaceful silence that enveloped the forest around me. As I turned the final bend before my cabin, My headlights illuminated a figure standing on my porch. My blood ran cold. There was a woman, probably in her early 30s, wearing what appeared to be a thin jacket completely unsuitable for the weather. More alarmingly, there wasn't another vehicle in sight. My driveway stretched empty behind my truck, and the surrounding area offered no hint of how she might have arrived. I parked beside the woodpile and cautiously stepped out, scanning the tree line for any movement. The crunch of snow beneath my boots seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness as I approached my cabin. The woman turned toward me, her face breaking into a wide, relieved smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank goodness you're home," she called out, her voice carrying an accent I couldn't quite place. "My car broke down about a mile back, and my phone is dead. I've been walking for what feels like forever." I kept my distance, positioning myself at the bottom of the porch steps. "That's rough," I replied, not moving closer. "Which direction did you come from?" I didn't pass any stranded vehicles on my way in. Her smile faltered slightly before returning, wider than before. "Oh, it's on one of those little side roads. I thought it might be a shortcut. You know how GPS can be so unreliable up here." I nodded, though I knew there weren't any side roads within miles that would qualify as shortcuts to anywhere. "The town's about 17 miles back down the main road," I offered. "If you head that way and turn right at the fork, you'll reach a gas station in about 5 miles where you can call a tow truck." Instead of acknowledging my directions, she hugged herself, visibly shivering. "It's so cold out here," she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "Could I possibly come in for just a few minutes to warm up? Maybe use your phone to call for help. I'd be so grateful." Something about her demeanor felt rehearsed, like an actress who'd memorized her lines but couldn't quite sell the emotion behind them. I'd lived in cities long enough to develop a sixth sense for danger, and every instinct was now screaming at me. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you with that," I said firmly. "I can drive you to the gas station myself if you're cold." Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flash of something calculated crossing her features before settling back into helpless vulnerability. "Please," she persisted, taking a step toward me. "Just for a few minutes. It's freezing out here." "I think it's best if you head toward town," I repeated, climbing the steps but maintaining enough distance that she couldn't easily touch me. "Or I can give you a ride, but I'm not comfortable having strangers in my home." The pleasant mask slipped again, this time revealing a flicker of annoyance. Then she laughed softly, as though we were sharing some private joke. "You're being silly," she said, her voice dropping to something more intimate. "I'm just a woman who needs a little help. What are you afraid might happen?" I reached past her and unlocked my door, careful to keep my body between her and the entrance. "My offer stands for the ride to town. Otherwise, I wish you luck." Before she could respond, I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, immediately engaging the deadbolt and chain lock as well. Through the window, I watched as she remained on the porch for several long moments, no longer pretending to shiver, before finally descending the steps and walking slowly down my driveway. I waited until she disappeared from view, before letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My hands were trembling as I poured myself a generous whiskey and collapsed into my armchair. To calm my nerves, I fired up my laptop and put on a documentary about ocean life, something soothing and far removed from my current situation. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sharp rap at the door. The documentary had ended, and the screen showed it was just after 11. Another knock followed, more insistent this time. "Hello, sir? I'm so sorry to bother you again," came the woman's voice, sounding distressed. "But I've been walking for hours, and I'm completely lost. Please, I think I might have frostbite. I just need to use your phone." I remained perfectly still, listening. Something about the quality of her voice seemed different. It echoed strangely, as though she wasn't standing directly at the door. I silently moved to the window and carefully pulled back the edge of the curtain, just enough to peek outside. What I saw turned my blood to ice. In the moonlight reflecting off the snow, I could make out at least 8 figures scattered around my property. 2 men stood at the edge of the tree line, near my truck. Another 3 were positioned along the side of the cabin, partially hidden in shadows. A couple more waited at the bottom of the porch steps. The woman stood at my door, and I noticed now that she held something in her hand, possibly a small radio or walkie-talkie. I backed away from the window and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. When the dispatcher answered, I whispered my situation and address, terrified that the people outside might hear me through the cabin's thin walls. While I waited for help to arrive, I heard them moving around the perimeter of the cabin, their footsteps crunching in the snow. They spoke in hushed tones, and I caught fragments of conversation, something about another place further up, and taking too long. The woman continued her performance at the door, her voice rising and falling in practiced distress, occasionally calling out what she claimed was her situation. Not once did any of them try to force entry, which somehow made the whole scenario even more terrifying. They were patient, waiting for me to make the mistake of opening the door voluntarily. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 20 minutes, I saw the blessed flash of red and blue lights reflecting off the snow through my window. The response time was remarkably fast for such a remote location. Later, I would learn that a state trooper had coincidentally been less than 5 miles away when the call came through. The moment the patrol car's headlights appeared down my driveway, the figures scattered, melting into the forest with practiced efficiency. By the time the officer reached my door, there was no sign of the woman or her companions aside from multiple sets of footprints in the fresh snow. The officer took my statement and searched the surrounding area, but found nothing except tracks leading deep into the forest, away from the road and in the opposite direction from town. He advised me to stay vigilant and promised to increase patrols in the area. 5 days later, I received a call from that same officer. A family living in a remote cabin about 12 miles further into the mountains had been found dead. Husband, wife, and their teenage son. Their home had been ransacked, but the doors had been unlocked, with no signs of forced entry or struggle. Their vehicle was missing, and judging by the food left on the table, they had been in the middle of dinner when whatever happened, happened. The officer didn't explicitly connect the dots for me, but he didn't need to. I knew in my bones that the same group had succeeded elsewhere, where they had failed with me. The thought that I might have ended up like that family, or worse, that I might have inadvertently helped them by giving the woman a ride to another isolated home, still haunts me to this day. I sold the cabin 3 weeks later and moved back to the city. Sometimes I miss the peace and quiet of mountain living, but I'll never again take for granted the security that comes with having neighbors close enough to hear you scream. Let me tell you about something that happened to me last winter. I worked the graveyard shift at a data center in rural Montana, 3 nights a week, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. This schedule means I've gotten used to being awake when the rest of the world is asleep, even on my days off. There's something peaceful about those quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when it feels like the universe belongs to just you and the stars. After about a year on this schedule, I finally stopped trying to force myself back into a normal routine on my off days. It was just making me perpetually exhausted and irritable. So I embraced my nocturnal lifestyle completely. I'd usually sleep until around 4 in the afternoon and stay up until around 8 or 9 in the morning. It was actually pretty great once I committed to it. I had the whole night to myself while everyone else was sleeping. One night in January, during a rare warm spell that melted most of the snow, I decided to go for a late-night hike. It was about 2 in the morning, which for me was like early afternoon. I'd eaten my breakfast, caught up on some reading, and decided I needed to stretch my legs. There's a beautiful nature preserve that borders my property. One of the reasons I bought this place, despite its remote location. The preserve has a 5-mile loop trail that winds through pine forests and around a small lake. During the day, it's fairly popular, but at night, it's completely deserted. Or at least, it's supposed to be. I was finishing my second loop when I noticed a figure standing on the path ahead. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe another night owl enjoying the unseasonable warmth. But as I got closer, something felt off. He was just standing there, completely motionless, wearing a pale gray hoodie and baggy cargo pants. The moonlight was bright enough that I could see he was facing my direction, but I couldn't make out his features. As I approached, I expected him to acknowledge me with a nod or a quiet hello. That's what people normally do when they encounter each other in such isolated spots. Instead, he remained perfectly still until I was about to pass him. Then, very slowly, he turned his head to follow my movement. Just his head, while the rest of his body remained frozen in place. The unnatural quality of that movement sent a chill down my spine. After I passed, I glanced back and saw that he hadn't moved from his spot. He was just standing there, his head now turned in my direction. I picked up my pace a bit, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe he was just some guy meditating or something. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to cut my hike short and head back. The trail loops around the lake before returning to the main entrance, so I'd have to pass that spot again unless I wanted to bushwhack through the forest. I chose the latter, taking a smaller maintenance path that the park rangers use. It added about 20 minutes to my journey, but I preferred that to encountering the strange man again. When I finally reached the main trail near the entrance, I breathed a sigh of relief. But that relief was short-lived. Standing at the trailhead, illuminated by the single solar-powered lamp, was the same figure in the gray hoodie. There was absolutely no way he could have gotten there before me, unless he had sprinted at an incredible speed. And even then, I should have heard him running on the gravel path. my heart hammering in my chest. I turned and began walking quickly toward my house, staying on the dimly lit road rather than taking my usual shortcut through the woods. The road route added nearly a mile to my walk home, but it felt safer somehow, more exposed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I didn't see him following me. When I finally reached my house, I locked the door behind me, drew the blinds, and poured myself a glass of water with shaking hands. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was letting my imagination run wild. I sat down on my couch, flipped on the TV, and tried to distract myself with a late-night show. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps on my wooden porch. Slow, deliberate steps that stopped right in front of my door. I muted the TV and sat perfectly still, listening. No knock came. No doorbell rang. Just silence. After about 30 seconds, curiosity overcame my fear, and I crept to the peephole and looked out. The man in the gray hoodie stood on my porch, about 3 feet from my door. I could see his face now, unnaturally pale, with dark circles under his eyes that looked almost like bruises. His expression was blank, devoid of any emotion. He wasn't looking at the door, but instead seemed to be studying my house, his gaze moving methodically across the facade. I backed away from the door, trying not to make a sound. My phone was in the kitchen, and I slowly made my way there, never taking my eyes off the front door. I called the sheriff's department. We don't have local police out here, and reported a suspicious person at my property. The dispatcher told me a deputy was about 20 minutes away and advised me to stay on the line. I crept back to the peephole. The man was still there, in exactly the same position, still examining my house with that same methodical gaze. He didn't knock, didn't try the doorknob, didn't do anything that a normal person would do. He just observed. For the entire 18 minutes it took for the sheriff's deputy to arrive, the man never moved from that spot. When the patrol car pulled into my driveway, its headlights illuminating the porch, the man slowly turned toward it. He made no attempt to run or hide. The deputy approached him, and I could see them talking through the peephole, though I couldn't hear what they were saying. After a few minutes, the deputy knocked on my door. When I opened it, the man in the gray hoodie was sitting in the back of the patrol car. He says he's staying at the Pinewood Motel, the deputy told me. Claims he got lost hiking and was trying to figure out where he was. Says he thought this might be the ranger station. I explained that the ranger station was on the opposite side of the preserve, with a large sign out front, and that there was no way he could have mistaken my house for it. The deputy nodded thoughtfully. Well, he hasn't actually broken any laws that I can charge him with, he said. But something's definitely off about him. I'll run his ID, take him back to the motel, and have a word with the manager there. You might want to invest in some security cameras. I thanked him and watched as the patrol car drove away with the strange man in the back seat. I didn't sleep at all that night, jumping at every creak and rustle of the wind. The next day, curious despite my fear, I drove to the Pinewood Motel. The manager confirmed that they'd had a guest matching that description, but he had checked out early that morning. He'd paid in cash and left no forwarding address. I installed security cameras the following week and started carrying pepper spray on my hikes. I also varied my route and timing just to be safe. I never saw the man in the gray hoodie again. But sometimes, when I'm hiking that trail at night, I get the distinct feeling that I'm being watched. The sheriff's deputy later told me they ran the ID the man provided, and it belonged to someone who had died 3 years earlier in Idaho. Whoever he was, whatever he wanted, he was gone now, at least from my part of the woods. But I often wonder if he's out there somewhere, standing motionless on another trail, turning just his head to watch as hikers pass by in the dark. It was a frigid winter night in rural Vermont, and I was alone in my grandfather's colonial farmhouse, nursing a mug of bourbon-spiked coffee to keep me alert. The deadline for my dissertation loomed just 48 hours away, and finishing my work tonight would give me the breathing room I desperately needed before my final defense next week. The howling wind rattled the century-old windows as snow piled against the north side of the house. I'd retreated to the study on the second floor, a room filled with leather-bound books and the lingering scent of my grandfather's pipe tobacco, where the ancient radiator actually worked well enough to keep my fingers from going numb. I was deep in concentration, the blue glow of my laptop illuminating my tired face, when the first sound broke my focus. A dull thud from somewhere downstairs. I glanced up at the mahogany door of the study, listening intently. The old farmhouse had stood through countless Vermont winters, and I told myself it was just the building settling under the weight of fresh snow, or perhaps a branch scraping against the kitchen window. I returned to my work, determined to push through at least one more chapter before allowing myself a few precious hours of sleep. But not 5 minutes later, another sound, different this time, like something heavy being dragged across the wooden floorboards. Setting my coffee down, I rose from the creaking desk chair and moved to the doorway. The hallway beyond was pitch black. I'd kept all the other lights off to save on the ridiculous heating bill. I stood there, straining my ears against the silence, trying to calculate if investigating was worth the disruption to my workflow. After 30 seconds of nothing but the wind's mournful cry, I retreated back to my desk, chiding myself for being so easily distracted. The farmhouse was nearly 200 years old. Strange noises were part of its charm, however unsettling they might be after midnight. For almost 2 hours, I worked without interruption, making significant progress on my analysis section. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway had just struck 2 when a much louder crash echoed through the house. It sounded like it came from the basement, directly beneath the kitchen, and was far too deliberate to be dismissed as the house settling. My heart rate quickened as I pushed back from the desk and strode quickly to the hallway. Standing at the top of the main staircase, I peered down into the darkness below. Moonlight streamed through the frost-covered windows, casting elongated shadows across the antique furniture. The house remained utterly still and silent. Gathering my courage, I descended 3 steps, gripping the polished banister tightly. From this vantage point, I could see part of the kitchen and the closed door that led down to the basement. Everything seemed undisturbed. I waited another minute, listening for any subtle sound that might betray an intruder's presence. Nothing. I retreated back to the study, my mind racing with possibilities, yet still unable to truly believe. Someone would brave this blizzard to break into an isolated farmhouse. I returned to my laptop, but my concentration was broken. Every few minutes, my eyes would drift to the partially open door, anticipating another disturbance. Just as I was beginning to relax again, a floorboard creaked in the hallway, not downstairs, but right outside the study. My blood turned to ice as a shadow moved past the doorway. In that fraction of a second, I caught the silhouette of a tall figure passing by, heading toward my grandfather's bedroom. There was no mistake. Someone was in the house with me. Panic surged through my body. I heard the intruder enter the master bedroom and begin rummaging through drawers. Moving as quietly as possible, I reached the study door and locked it, wincing at the soft click of the mechanism. The movement in the neighboring room stopped abruptly. 3 seconds of terrible silence passed, and then heavy footsteps began marching directly toward my door. I backed away, frantically searching for something, anything, I could use to defend myself. I grabbed a heavy brass letter opener from the desk, knowing it was pitiful protection, but better than nothing. The doorknob rattled violently as the intruder tried to enter. Then came the first shoulder slam against the solid oak door, the frame groaning under the assault. Each impact felt like it would splinter the wood, but the old craftsmanship held. After 4 thunderous attempts, the pounding stopped. I heard ragged breathing on the other side, followed by footsteps moving away toward the stairs. My shaking hands fumbled for my phone, and I dialed 911 as I listened to the intruder descend to the first floor. I whispered my emergency to the dispatcher, terrified the intruder would hear me. The front door opened and closed, and for a brief moment I thought they had left. But then came the sound I'll never forget, scraping outside the house, like someone climbing up the exterior wall. Within seconds, there was scratching at the window of the study, a window that overlooked a 20-foot drop with no ledge or trellis to assist a climber. How could anyone be out there in this storm at that height? The scratching intensified, and then the curtains parted slightly of their own accord. I glimpsed a pale face peering in, eyes reflecting the glow of my laptop in a way that seemed almost luminous. The face was gaunt, with features distorted by the frost on the glass, but the expression was one of focused hunger. I backed into the farthest corner, clutching the letter opener so tightly my knuckles turned white. The window began to inch upward despite being locked, as if the mechanism was being manipulated from outside. Cold air and snowflakes rushed in through the widening gap. A hand, unnaturally long-fingered and gray, curled around the window frame. Just then, blue and red lights flashed through the trees, lining the long driveway. The sheriff's department had arrived in record time, likely because Deputy Hanson lived just down the road. The hand withdrew instantly, and I heard what sounded like someone or something scrabbling rapidly down the side of the house. When the police entered and searched the property, they found fresh footprints in the snow leading away from the house and into the woods, but the blizzard quickly obscured the trail. More disturbing were the marks on the side of the house, deep gouges in the wooden siding that led all the way up to the study window, as if someone had climbed using only their fingernails for purchase. The police report cited an attempted burglary, suggesting the intruder might have been looking for prescription medications or valuables, perhaps desperate enough to brave the storm. They increased patrols in the area for the next few weeks, but no similar incidents were reported. I moved out of the farmhouse the next day. What haunts me most aren't the questions about who the intruder was or what they wanted. It's the certainty that no human could have climbed that exterior wall in a blizzard, and the memory of those eyes staring through the glass, hungry not for valuables, I'm convinced, but for something else entirely. Sometimes when the wind howls on winter nights, I imagine I hear scratching at my window, and I wonder if whatever visited me that night is still searching, still hungry, still determined to finish what it started. I was driving back from my winter cabin in northern Montana. The journey home to Seattle was supposed to be long, about 18 hours, but I was determined to do it in one shot without stopping at a hotel. I'd done similar trips before, and with enough coffee and classic rock keeping me company, I figured I'd make it just fine. When the heavy snow started falling around midnight, my eyes began to feel like they were made of lead. I forced myself to stay alert, munching on beef jerky and sipping the last of my energy drink. But the caffeine buzz was fading fast. I knew eventually I'd need to pull over, maybe just for an hour, or even rest until dawn. The highway had become eerily empty, and I hadn't seen another vehicle for at least 40 minutes. No towns or rest stops appeared on the horizon, just endless pine trees and mountains looming in the darkness. I slowed down and checked my GPS to see what places might be coming up, but the nearest town was still over an hour away. With the snow getting heavier and my eyelids growing heavier by the minute, I honestly wasn't sure if I could make it there safely. After fighting to stay awake for another 15 minutes, I realized I couldn't continue. Through the swirling snow, I spotted a sign indicating a truck stop half a mile ahead. I signaled, though there was no one behind me to signal for, and took the exit. The truck stop was isolated, situated at the junction of two deserted roads that seemed to lead into absolute nothingness. A single flickering neon sign reading "Last Chance Gas" cast an eerie blue glow over the empty parking lot. I pulled into a spot near the small convenience store and spent the next several minutes watching from my car, making sure the place was safe. Strange that there were no trucks here at a truck stop, I thought. Not a single vehicle approached the station, and not even one car passed by on the main road. The convenience store appeared dark inside, with only a security light illuminating what looked like an empty cashier's counter. It was an unsettling place to be stranded, but I didn't feel threatened since there seemed to be no one around. I reclined my seat, turned off the engine to save gas, and drifted off to sleep with the soft patter of snowflakes hitting my windshield as a lullaby. I don't remember checking the time before falling asleep, but when I opened my eyes, my dashboard clock read 3:15 in the morning. I was in that foggy state between sleeping and waking, unsure at first what had roused me. Then I heard it, a metallic scraping sound coming from outside. I turned my head slowly and saw a tall, gaunt figure standing by one of the gas pumps. The person was wearing what looked like an old-fashioned attendant's uniform, but something was off about it. The outfit seemed worn and tattered around the edges. I could see him fiddling with something at the pump, but the structure blocked most of my view. What I couldn't see, however, was his vehicle. There wasn't one in the parking lot, not even by the pumps. I scanned the area again and still saw no other cars or trucks anywhere. The falling snow had created a pristine white blanket across the entire lot, unmarked by tire tracks or footprints, which made no sense at all. The figure continued doing whatever he was doing for another minute, then turned and walked away. I lost sight of him when the gas station structure blocked my view, but it appeared he was heading toward the road. After a few minutes, I assumed he was gone, but I still had no idea what he had been doing there, which left me feeling deeply uneasy. I was too exhausted to dwell on it, though. The warmth of my car and the hypnotic effect of the now heavy snowfall lulled me back toward sleep. I closed my eyes, thinking I'd just rest until dawn. I couldn't have been asleep for more than 20 minutes when I jolted awake to the sound of something tapping against my car window. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned to see the same tall figure peering into my car through the driver's side window. Only now I could see his face clearly in the blue neon light. His skin was pale, too pale, with deep-set eyes that reflected the neon like a cat's. But what froze my blood was his expression, or rather, the complete lack of one. He stared through the glass with no emotion whatsoever, as if he wasn't even seeing me. I heard him trying the door handle. Once, twice, 3 times. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought it might burst from my chest. The man was behaving as if he didn't even notice I was inside the car. Yet he was looking directly through the window. Perhaps the lighting was too poor for him to see me, or perhaps the thought that crept into my mind then was too disturbing to entertain. This man clearly had malicious intentions. I remained perfectly still, barely breathing, hoping he would just go away. Suddenly, he turned and walked back toward the side of the gas station. He bent down to pick something up, and that's when I instantly started my car, hit the gas, and backed out as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I saw the figure straighten up, holding what looked like a rusted tire iron in his hands. He stood motionless in the falling snow, watching my taillights disappear into the night. But the most chilling part, in the fresh snow covering the parking lot, I could see my tire tracks clearly, but there were no footprints around the pumps or leading to my car. None at all. My heart was pounding so violently that I was now completely awake, and stayed that way for the remaining 10 hours of my journey. What that man, if he was a man, was trying to do, I truly don't want to know. But the circumstances surrounding the encounter were terrifying. He had obviously been there tampering with the gas pumps, and was just moments away from breaking my window and doing something. I later searched online for information about that truck stop. According to local legend, it was built on the site of a gruesome accident in the 1970s, when a gas station attendant was crushed between 2 semi-trucks during a blizzard. They say on snowy nights, he still tries to service vehicles that stop there, and becomes enraged when he can't complete his work. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I do know one thing for certain. I'll never drive that stretch of highway again without enough caffeine to keep me alert for days. I live in rural Vermont on a property surrounded by dense pine forests, with a long, winding driveway that connects to County Road 37. It was mid-autumn, the leaves painted in vibrant oranges and reds, when everything happened. That afternoon, while clearing fallen branches after a storm had passed through, something strange caught my attention. A figure, someone dressed as a Victorian plague doctor, was walking unhurriedly along the road. They stopped precisely at the beginning of my driveway, positioning themselves in the center, as if measuring each movement with deliberate care. Slowly, they turned their head in my direction, while their body remained facing the road. I have to admit, the costume was unsettling. That long black coat, wide-brimmed hat, and especially the beaked mask that obscured their face entirely. I chuckled nervously, almost instinctively, and tried to offer a friendly wave. Based on stories you hear nowadays, I half expected them to suddenly lunge forward in an attempt to frighten me. But that didn't happen. Instead, they simply turned their masked face back toward the road and continued walking. That long beak profile stark against the autumn sky. I considered calling out something, but deep down preferred not to engage more than necessary. The encounter left me uneasy, but I dismissed it as someone playing an early Halloween prank. Later that evening, as darkness settled over the mountains, I finished my routine of locking the barn and turning off the exterior lights. Once inside, I began preparing dinner while a documentary played quietly in the background. As I chopped vegetables, something captured my attention, a faint scratching sound coming from outside. I opened the kitchen window slightly, trying to hear better, but only the wind and rustling leaves made themselves known. I took a deep breath, closed the window securely, and returned to my cooking. What happened next nearly stopped my heart. Violent, rhythmic knocking echoed against the very window I had just locked. My body froze in a mix of panic and adrenaline. Trembling, with my heart racing wildly, I grabbed the knife from the cutting board and forced myself to look toward the window. However, the darkness outside concealed anything that might have been there. I knew I needed to face my fear. I walked over to the sliding glass door in the kitchen, the one leading to the back porch. With hesitation, I positioned my finger on the light switch, waited several seconds trying to gather courage, and finally flipped it on. What the light revealed was worse than anything my mind could have imagined. The same plague doctor stood motionless outside, now tilting their head to the side like a curious raven, observing me from behind that macabre beaked mask. The leather gloves, the cane they carried, every detail was perfect and perfectly terrifying. My first instinct, well, I thought I should open the door and confront them, maybe even attack first. But it's always easy to decide afterward what should have been done. In that moment, I simply fled, racing up the stairs to the bedroom where my phone was charging, and called the police. While waiting, I heard the knocking growing louder. They were banging on the glass door with both hands, one strike after another, increasingly aggressive. The situation worsened when they began to shout, a horrifying, uncontrolled sound, like someone in profound delirium or speaking in tongues. Words I couldn't understand, but the tone sent shivers through my entire body. I felt trapped. Each minute waiting for the police seemed to drag endlessly, until suddenly, the knocking stopped. From outside, a firm and familiar voice echoed, "What do you think you're doing? Get away from there right now." I peered through the bedroom window and saw Alina, my elderly neighbor, coming toward my house with a shotgun in her hands. The plague doctor had turned to face her, standing perfectly still. Alina didn't hesitate. She fired a warning shot into the air that echoed through the valley. The figure bolted with surprising speed, disappearing into the forest, that long coat flowing behind them like wings in the darkness. By the time I came downstairs to thank Alina, she was already on my porch, shotgun lowered but still ready. "I saw the lights flashing in your windows," she explained. "Knew something wasn't right. Those carnival freaks have been bothering folks all week since that traveling show set up past the old mill." Shortly after, the police arrived, took my description, and conducted a quick search of the area that lasted no more than 15 minutes before they left. They mentioned something about similar reports from other properties along the forest edge. Alina insisted I spend the night at her house for safety. "You don't take chances when it comes to your well-being," she said with the certainty of someone who had lived through enough to know better. Now, as I recount this story, 3 days have passed, and the traveling carnival has moved on. But sometimes, when I look out toward the forest edge at dusk, I can't shake the feeling that someone in a beaked mask is watching, waiting for the right moment to return. What troubles me most isn't the fear I felt that night, but the realization that I never heard the carnival music that should have accompanied such a show. Just the unnatural silence of the forest, broken only by that strange, rhythmic knocking. A few weeks ago, a mysterious account appeared on TikTok spreading disturbing messages and unsettling images of people dressed as clowns. Among the posts was a specific threat. They would appear at my college campus during midterms week. Initially, many thought it was just a tasteless prank designed to unnerve already stressed students. But the campus administration decided not to take any chances. Campus security was doubled, and to our surprise, even local police officers were stationed around the grounds to monitor the situation. The time indicated in the posts was around 3 in the afternoon, right when most students would be changing classes or gathering in common areas. When the clock struck 3, the atmosphere across campus became tense, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. My roommate and I still believed it was all just an elaborate hoax. Someone even mentioned they had spotted a clown near the campus, like chasing after a jogger. I just laughed, thinking it was another absurd rumor spreading through our already paranoid campus. Shortly after 3:15, the strained voice of our dean echoed through the emergency notification system. "We are initiating lockdown protocols. Secure all doors and windows immediately." Despite the shock, I maintained my composure. We followed the standard procedure, everyone huddled in the corner of the lecture hall, away from doors and windows. We remained like this in silence for nearly 2 hours when finally, the dean announced that it was safe to return to our dormitories or off-campus housing. I felt an immense relief. I gathered my things and began my walk back to my apartment in the small town adjacent to campus. My place is about 3/4 of a mile from the university center. Normally, a pleasant 15-minute stroll through a scenic wooded path that connects the campus to the residential area. I put my headphones on and started my journey, soon entering the tree-lined pathway that, on that particular day, seemed unusually darker and more foreboding than I remembered. About 7 minutes into my walk, I noticed something odd, a figure wearing vibrant clothes in the distance, partially obscured by the autumn foliage. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after the day's tension. But when I looked again, there it was, a person wearing white pants decorated with yellow polka dots, all torn and filthy. They wore an equally weathered yellow shirt that completed the disturbing ensemble. Their face was covered with a mask, with bright green hair protruding from the sides. The head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and they were just standing there, staring directly at me. Suddenly, they let out a shrill, uncontrolled laugh that echoed through the trees before sprinting toward me with unexpected speed. My instinct kicked in. I dropped my backpack, screamed, and bolted back toward campus, my heart pounding in my ears louder than the music still playing through my forgotten headphones. When I reached the campus security office, breathless and trembling, I reported what had happened. The officer cursed under his breath and immediately radioed for backup. Within minutes, several security personnel and police officers headed toward the area I had indicated. I never found out if they managed to catch the clown, but I desperately want to believe they did. Rumors spread across campus that a clown had made it as far as the main entrance of the administration building, threatening to enter before being spotted by security. I didn't witness any of this myself, but it very well could have been the same individual I encountered. The police organized an extensive search throughout the surrounding woods and neighborhood, but they likely escaped and hid somewhere in the dense forest that borders our small college town. This means that somewhere out there, that clown is still free, potentially spreading fear and causing more terror in our community. The university has since installed additional lighting along the wooded path, and they now offer security escorts for students traveling to off-campus housing. I've never walked that path alone again. I either take the longer route along the main road or make sure I'm with at least 2 other people. Sometimes at night, I still hear that haunting laugh in my dreams, and I wonder if we'll ever know who was behind that mask or why they targeted our campus. What started as what we thought was just an internet prank has fundamentally changed how safe I feel in a place I once considered my second home. I check over my shoulder more often now, and I don't listen to music when walking anywhere. Some lessons you learn the hard way, and I learned that sometimes the monsters from our childhood fears find new ways to haunt us as adults. I needed to share this story because I still can't get it out of my head. I decided to go camping for the first time with Jason, my boyfriend, despite feeling a knot in my stomach. I'd always heard unsettling stories about Blackwood Ridge. Many of these were mentioned in supernatural encounters, podcasts, and forums. Beyond that, my grandfather, when he was young, experienced something so frightening and traumatic in that region that he avoided talking about it. When we would drive from Portland to Seattle, he preferred taking the longer route along Highway 99, bypassing the ridge entirely. And when there was no choice but to cross through Blackwood Ridge, the journey was always hurried and silent. Because of all this, I already carried an apprehension, almost a reverent respect for that place. Still, Jason's enthusiasm was so contagious that I eventually gave in. His family had many happy memories from there and never encountered anything out of the ordinary. We left Portland at dawn, stopped for a leisurely breakfast, and continued our journey. At a certain point, we left the asphalt and took a dirt road, arriving at the wooded area Jason loved so much at the exact moment. The sun began to disappear over the horizon. Despite the forecast of unexpected frost, a rare phenomenon, but not impossible in that area in late autumn, we decided to proceed. We set up our tent and made a fire to prepare a simple meal. The sky, filled with countless stars, was something only Blackwood Ridge could offer. However, the wind began to howl, and the temperature dropped rapidly. Soon, frost began to form, extinguishing our fire and forcing us to take shelter inside the tent. The night progressed after good conversations and laughter. The sounds of nature gradually calmed us, but in the middle of the night, a disconcerting silence took over. It was a silence so dense that it made us realize how isolated we were, or at least that's what we thought. Around midnight, I woke up with my heart racing. A dry sound of branches breaking came from very close by. Jason noticed my nervousness and became alert. The noise not only continued, but got closer, accompanied by a deep, guttural sound, something that seemed to come from a large creature, the size of a horse, walking slowly around the tent. Jason tried to calm me, suggesting it might be some animal disoriented by the frost. Maybe a moose strayed from its group. He had seen some around during nights before. He grabbed a flashlight, made a small tear in the tent, and peered out. What we saw made our blood freeze. A creature was moving around us, large like a horse, but with its body twisted in an unnatural way, as if its limbs were bent at impossible angles. The sound of bones cracking accompanied each movement. The head was the most terrifying part, something between a monkey and a human, but with the skull exposed, skinless from the upper half up, showing only bones. I held back my scream with all my strength. Jason immediately turned off the flashlight. The creature seemed to just sniff around, as if trying to locate us, but without seeing us clearly. It emitted a low growl and continued breaking branches as it walked, coming dangerously close. Each second seemed eternal until, for some reason, it lost interest and moved away. We heard its footsteps growing more distant until everything dissolved back into silence. I have no idea how we held out until dawn, but as soon as the first rays of sunlight appeared, we made the decision to pack everything as quickly as possible and leave that forest behind. While gathering our things, we came across deep footprints marked in the ground, mixed between mud and frost, as well as broken branches all around, confirmation that this wasn't a simple nightmare. The years have passed, but that night on Blackwood Ridge remains vivid in my memory. I never shared this experience with my grandfather. I can't predict how he would react, but I suspect his experience there might be completely different, since the ridge holds secrets that few can explain. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I still hear that sound, bones cracking and branches breaking. And I wonder what ancient, twisted thing calls Blackwood Ridge its home. Jason and I made a pact never to return, but lately, I've been having recurring dreams drawing me back there. In my dreams, the creature speaks to me in a language I almost understand. Last week, I found an old journal of my grandfather's in the attic. The final entry, dated exactly 50 years before our camping trip, was stained and partially torn. The only legible words sent chills down my spine. It remembers. And it waits. Blackwood knows my name now. I've been thinking about visiting my grandfather at his nursing home. Maybe it's time to finally ask what happened to him all those years ago on Blackwood Ridge. Maybe our encounters are connected somehow. Or maybe some secrets are better left buried in the silence of those ancient woods. It was a Tuesday night, well past 2 in the morning, when I was heading back to my apartment after a late study session at the campus library. The walk was short, just under 3/4 of a mile, but long enough for the solitude and silence to make me uneasy. The summer air was thick with humidity, as if the nearby bayou had absorbed all the life and left it suspended in the darkness. I decided to cut through Jackson Memorial Park, a choice that seemed practical but quickly proved to be a mistake. During daylight hours, this park was a popular spot where families picnicked and joggers followed the winding paths between ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss. But at night, everything transformed. The trees formed a dense canopy, blocking out the stars, and what little moonlight struggled through the cloud cover. My phone's flashlight cast a beam that seemed pathetically small against the vastness of the darkness surrounding me. Each footstep on the gravel path seemed to echo louder than it should, and I started to regret not taking the longer, well-lit route along Boulevard Avenue. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks, perhaps an echo of my own steps bouncing off the trees. But as I paused to listen, I realized I wasn't alone. There was another rhythm, another presence. Maybe someone else using the park as a shortcut, but something about the cadence of those footfalls seemed wrong. I remembered stories circulating online about strange masked figures appearing in parks after midnight. Stories I had always dismissed as urban legends or internet hoaxes. But standing there in the suffocating darkness, they suddenly seemed entirely plausible. I turned off my flashlight and ducked behind a massive oak tree. My heart was hammering so hard I feared it might be audible, my chest rising and falling in an uncontrolled rhythm. But I forced myself to remain still. For a moment, I considered that fear might be playing tricks on me. Perhaps it was just another student trying to get home, just like me. But then I saw them, 2 figures standing motionless, not far away. Even in the weak ambient light, their costumes were unmistakable carnival masks, but not the festive kind. These were grotesque, antique-looking things with elongated features and cracked porcelain surfaces. Their clothes weren't cheerful, but bizarrely mismatched, as if assembled from pieces of vintage garments that had been buried and recently exhumed. Most disturbing was their complete stillness, like statues planted in the middle of the path. They knew I was there. They must have seen the beam of my flashlight before I turned it off. And now, positioned squarely in the middle of the path, they were deliberately blocking my way. Fear took over, and for several seconds I remained frozen, trying to decide what to do. The air felt heavier, as if the environment itself had turned against me. Then, as if they knew exactly how to unnerve me further, they began to move. The movement was slow, deliberate. Each step they took seemed louder than physics should allow, reverberating through the park like a warning. My urge to scream was overcome by pure survival instinct. As soon as I realized they were coming toward me, I didn't wait any longer. I ran. I ran like never before, not looking back. The vegetation seemed alive, branches and vines attempting to hold me back. But I didn't stop. When I finally reached the streetlights of Magnolia Drive, my legs nearly gave out. The relief lasted only a moment. When I glanced back, there was no sign of them, but that didn't comfort me. I sprinted all the way to my apartment building, fumbled with my keys, stumbled inside, locked the deadbolt, drew the blinds, and collapsed onto the floor, trying to catch my breath. A few minutes later, curiosity got the better of me. I needed to check. I went to the window and pulled the blind aside slightly. My heart nearly stopped across the street. Standing perfectly still near the entrance to the park were the two figures, motionless as before, staring directly at my building. At that moment, there was no more doubt. They were following me. But why? The idea that this might be just a cruel prank was tempting. But something about their behavior suggested otherwise. They weren't trying to frighten people for fun. It was something else, something I couldn't comprehend. The night passed slowly. Every small noise seemed like a harbinger of something worse. Finally, exhaustion overcame me, but my rest was interrupted by a sound that froze my blood, a tapping on my bedroom window. It was gentle at first, as if someone was testing for a reaction. Then it grew louder and more insistent. I couldn't move. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to pretend I was sleeping, but the tapping continued. When I finally gathered the courage to look, I saw a face beneath the small gap between the curtain and the window, a face tilted sideways, watching me. The mask's features were more visible now, cracked white porcelain, with faded decorative patterns and hollow eyes that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The painted lips were curved into an exaggerated smile, as if delighting in my terror. I don't remember exactly how I reacted. I ran to my roommate's bedroom, shouting and crying like a child. He woke immediately, grabbed the baseball bat he kept beside his bed, and went to check. When he raised the blinds, there was no one there. But what he saw was enough to make me feel I wasn't crazy. Handprints on the glass, drawn with what looked like dirt and something darker that glistened in the streetlight. Since that night, the feeling of being watched has never left me. The masked figures haven't appeared again, at least not that I've seen. But something tells me this isn't over. Next time, I'll be ready. I've installed a security camera aimed at my window and motion-activated lights around the entire apartment. But deep down, what terrifies me most is the thought that perhaps they don't need to show themselves for me to know they're there. Sometimes at night, I still hear faint tapping on my window, though when I check, the street below is empty. And occasionally, when walking past the park in broad daylight, I catch glimpses of something white moving between the trees, always just at the edge of my peripheral vision, always gone when I turn to look directly. What's worse, my roommate moved out last week, said he couldn't sleep here anymore. Before he left, he admitted something he'd been keeping from me on the night of the incident. After I'd finally fallen asleep, he looked out the window one more time. The figures were still there, but they weren't looking at our building anymore. They were looking at him. A newly built house, constructed with effort and filled with dreams. A space that should have been the beginning of something beautiful, simple, and full of life. But what happens when something starts to feel different? When the familiar carries an inexplicable discomfort? Have you ever had the feeling that something, no matter how small, isn't where it should be? This is one of those stories. A tale that reveals much more than a home under construction. From the first bricks to the secrets the walls hide. I decided to share this account because it represents a crucial period in my life when everything seemed to conspire against something as simple as our desire to live in peace. My name is Marcus. I'm 35 years old, and I lead a simple life. I'm one of those people who endures exhausting work shifts, but still finds reasons to smile alongside family when I get home. I don't have great possessions or luxuries to display, but honestly, that never bothered me. A few years ago, Gerald, my father-in-law, gifted us a plot of land on the outskirts of Willow Creek. It was a gesture I'll never be able to adequately repay. The neighborhood, it's true, was somewhat neglected, with dirt roads that transformed into complete chaos during rainstorms. But for us, that piece of ground was the starting point for something we'd always dreamed of, a home of our own. My wife Sarah and I began building with what little we had. She sold vintage clothing online, items that her relatives from Chicago would send. It wasn't a profitable business, but it always helped with weekly expenses. I worked as a middleman between local farmers and organic produce distributors. It was tough work, full of people trying to take advantage of the person in the middle. But over time, I learned to manage. Every penny we earned was treated like treasure. We didn't do this for ourselves, but for our 3 children, a girl and 2 boys. For many years, we lived with Sarah's parents. I never had reason to complain about them. They were always generous and attentive, both to us and the children. But I dreamed of a space that was ours, a place where I could hang a lamp without asking permission or decide on my own where to hang a picture. Sarah shared this dream. At night, we'd talk about what our house would be like. She wanted large windows to fill the rooms with light, and I wanted a yard where the children could play freely. It was a simple desire, but it was ours. After a full day's work, I would still stop by the lot to help the builders. I'd arrive exhausted, with the smell of soil embedded in my hands and feet heavy from walking. But seeing the foundations of the house being raised renewed my energy. I learned from the builders how to mix cement, carry blocks, and lay bricks. It wasn't my area of expertise, but it made me feel part of the construction, as if each wall raised was a step closer to our dream. At first, we had little contact with the neighbors, just nods or passing smiles. They seemed cordial but reserved, just like us. Sometimes I needed to knock on someone's door to borrow a tool, a hammer, a drill. It was inevitable. Over time, I noticed something strange. People would comment about us in a peculiar way. Not the closest neighbors, but those who lived farther away, those who observed us from a distance. They said we were standoffish, that we didn't socialize, that we thought we were better than them. That confused me. Sarah and I barely had time for ourselves, let alone to socialize. Still, some looks carried a kind of silent expectation, as if waiting for something to go wrong. Sarah and I decided we would only move when the house was completely finished. We made a point of carefully tending to each detail. One of the biggest milestones was completing the wall that surrounded the property. It provided not just privacy, but also security, allowing the children to play in the yard without worry. When we finally moved in, the house stood out in the neighborhood. It didn't seem to clash, but it was different, larger, with wide windows and the wall surrounding it. My father-in-law, seeing it completed, joked that it looked like a house from a gated community. The first months were peaceful. We organized our things, adjusted to the new space, and created a routine. We greeted neighbors when passing them on the street, and some even welcomed us. "Your house turned out beautiful," commented a woman while sweeping in front of hers. Sarah and I thanked her with smiles, but that was it. We weren't close with the neighbors, but we made a point to be polite. Over time, however, small conflicts emerged. The first was with a neighbor who loved playing music at an extremely high volume. The first few times, I tried to ignore it, thinking they were occasional parties. But it soon became clear it was a habit, especially on weekends. The music would start in the afternoon and extend into the early morning hours. Some nights the children could barely sleep, and that deeply irritated me. On one of those nights, close to midnight, I went out to the yard trying to clear my head. The noise was so loud, it seemed to be inside my house. Sarah, always calm, asked me not to intervene. "It's just parties. It's not worth causing trouble," she said. I tried to heed her advice, but it was hard to ignore my frustration. Another episode occurred a few weeks later. I parked my pickup in front of someone's house while organizing some things in our yard. I thought there wouldn't be a problem since it would be something quick, but the man came to knock on our door, clearly bothered. "Can you move your truck? It's in front of my house," he said without even a greeting. The tone wasn't rude, but it wasn't friendly either. "I'm sorry, I didn't think it would bother anyone," I said calmly. But he turned his back and went into his house without another word. I avoided confrontations and knew it wasn't worth insisting on arguments. Sarah, trying to calm me down, would say, "As long as we're good here inside, the rest doesn't matter." Even so, I felt that for some reason we didn't fit in. Sarah dedicated herself to decorating the house, caring for every detail with pieces she made herself. We tried to keep our focus on our family, our home, and the routine we built, leaving everything else second. One ordinary morning, as I was leaving for work, I found the white gate of the house vandalized with spray paint. It was a careless graffiti, without form or purpose, covering much of the front. I stood there staring at those stains, overcome by a mixture of shock and anger. That gate was one of the details that most enchanted us when finishing the house. We chose it because it brought a clean, modern air, and now it was completely ruined. The fresh paint reflected in the sun, and with each look, my annoyance grew. Sarah came up behind me, noticed the state of the gate, and asked who I thought might have done it. I already had my suspicions. A young man who lived a few houses away came to mind. I often heard about him, painting walls of abandoned lots and neglected spaces. He always walked around with a backpack and was accompanied by a group of friends. Although I had no concrete evidence, my instinct pointed to him. I took a deep breath, trying not to act on impulse. I spent the morning trying to clean the gate, but the traces of paint wouldn't completely disappear. I decided I needed something more practical and definitive, so I installed a security camera. I positioned it discreetly, out of sight, but with a clear view of the gate and the entrance to the house. The following weeks passed without incident, and the routine returned to normal. Even so, it was inevitable that from time to time, I would review the recordings, looking for any sign of trouble. For a while, everything seemed calm, until one morning, I found the gate vandalized again. This time, the design was larger, colorful, and much more elaborate, as if the author had all the time in the world to work. Anger consumed me again. I went straight to the camera footage without saying a word. As I imagined, my initial suspicion was confirmed. Although the face wasn't clear, the way of walking, the body, and the backpack were unmistakable. It was the same young man I had suspected from the beginning. I decided it was time to talk to him. I didn't know his name or many details, but I knew his house. That same day after work, I walked over. It was a simple construction with peeling walls and a rusty metal door that seemed abandoned. I knocked twice and waited. The door opened slowly, but it wasn't him who appeared. In his place emerged a woman appearing to be in her early 30s, wearing an apron with her hair tied back. "Good afternoon," I greeted, trying to control my tone. "By any chance, are you the mother of the young man who lives here?" She gave me an indecipherable look, followed by a brief pause, and responded with a dry tone, "I'm not his mother. I'm his girlfriend." I was surprised by the response, but didn't comment on it. I decided to get straight to the point. "I found my gate vandalized this morning with spray paint. It's the second time this has happened. I reviewed my security camera footage and clearly saw it was him who did it. I'm not here to cause problems, but I need this to stop." Her gaze hardened, and her expression showed growing irritation. "You're mistaken," she said, crossing her arms. "He wouldn't do something like that." "I'm not mistaken," I insisted firmly, but without raising my voice. "I saw it in the recordings. I don't want to create a fuss, but it's necessary to talk to him to clear this up." She maintained a rigid posture, looking at me as if drawing an invisible line. Finally, she said he wasn't home, and she didn't know when he'd return. Her voice was sharp, and the weight of discomfort in the air was almost palpable. "All right, just tell him I'd like to talk," I responded without directing any more words to her. She closed the door slowly, as if placing a period at the end of a sentence. Later that night, after dinner, I tried to relax. The children were entertained in their room. Sarah was washing dishes, and I was checking some messages on my phone. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasiness that the conversation and the day's events had left. Suddenly, a dry sound interrupted the tranquility of the house. I froze, trying to understand what it was. The noise repeated, louder and more insistent, followed by others, as if stones were being thrown against the gate. I got up immediately, feeling my heart race, and heard the frightened voices of the children coming from the room. Sarah appeared from the kitchen, holding our youngest son in her arms, her eyes filled with concern. "What's going on?" she asked in a tone that mixed fear and confusion. Without answering, I walked to the door, the blows still resonating from outside. Before opening, I took out my phone and accessed the security camera. What I saw made me freeze. It was him, the same young man, now more aggressive, with a stone in his hand and a face full of fury. Without thinking much, I opened the door and took a step outside. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound calm even with the alarm screaming inside me. He stared at me with eyes burning with rage, breathing heavily, as if on the verge of exploding. "Who do you think you are?" he snapped, pointing at me with one hand while holding the stone with the other. "Who do you think you are to accuse me of something I didn't do?" "I'm not accusing without reason," I responded, keeping my distance. "I saw the recordings. I just want to talk and understand what's going on." He exploded in shouts, his voice overflowing with resentment. "Understand what? You came here to humiliate me, to make me look bad just because you have money. You think that house of yours makes you better than us. You think you can step on those who have nothing." I raised my hands, trying to calm him. "That's not true. I'm not here to humiliate anyone. I just want to resolve this without trouble." "Shut up," he shouted, taking a step in my direction. "You and that house of yours are the problem. You came here thinking you can give orders, that you're better than everyone. Why don't you just leave?" His tone of aggression put me on maximum alert. The anger seemed to overflow to the point where he wouldn't listen to anything else. "I don't want to argue. We just need to find a solution," I insisted with a firm but calmer voice. "You shouldn't be here," he shouted again, raising the stone as if to throw it. "That house just gets in the way." I realized there was no more room for dialogue when he stepped forward, and without warning, pushed me forcefully. I didn't fall, but I staggered backward. It was enough to understand that he wasn't willing to talk. Without saying anything else, I turned and went into the house, closing the door behind me. As soon as the door was locked, stones began to hit the gate forcefully. Each impact made the walls vibrate, and the sound echoed through the house like a constant reminder of the tension outside. Inside, the sound of stones was muffled by the children's screams. My youngest son cried uncontrollably, while the other two clung to Sarah, frightened. She did her best to calm them, but her eyes reflected the same desperation I felt. I picked up the phone with trembling hands and called a close friend who worked in the local police department and whom I trusted. I explained what was happening in a few words. He promised he would send a patrol car immediately. The blows to the gate didn't stop. Each sounded more intense, as if wanting to break through the physical and psychological barriers that protected us. Sarah gave me looks of concern while holding the children against her chest, and I felt torn. I wanted to face the situation, but I feared what it might cause my family. Finally, the blue lights of the patrol car illuminated the street. Through the window, I saw two officers approach the young man. He resisted at first, shouting things I couldn't hear, but eventually gave in. They didn't arrest him, but they took him away that night. After that incident, there were unexpected gestures of kindness. Certain neighbors who had kept their distance began to approach. One afternoon, while washing my pickup in front of the house, an elderly couple stopped to chat. "We want you to know you're welcome here," said the woman with a welcoming smile. "That young man has always been trouble for the neighborhood. Don't worry, no one takes him seriously." Other neighbors also began to change their attitude. Greetings became more frequent, although not everyone was receptive. There were still suspicious looks and faces that turned away, but somehow the tension seemed to have diminished a bit. One Saturday, while finishing pruning plants in the yard, I smelled something strange. At first, I thought it might be something in the sewer, maybe a broken pipe. But the odor was different, strong, penetrating, an unpleasant mixture of gasoline and rotten eggs. I began to search for the source. The smell seemed to come from the other side of the wall that faced an alley between vacant lots. I went out through the side door and walked around. The closer I got, the stronger the odor became, to the point where I had to cover my nose and mouth. That's when I saw it, a dead chicken thrown at the base of our wall. Its feathers were covered by a black, viscous substance that looked like paint, but exuded an unbearable smell. I bent down to observe the substance more closely. It seemed to have been deliberately poured over the animal, as if someone had done it with intention. Immediately, the idea of coincidence dissipated. I looked around, searching for any sign of who might have done it. But the alley was deserted, and the nearby houses remained silent. Everything seemed so calm that the contrast with what I had just found was even more disturbing. I returned home without saying anything. I didn't want Sarah or the children to see that scene. There was something deeply wrong, and it left me uneasy. I grabbed a shovel and 2 bags to get rid of the chicken. I dug a small hole in a lot near the alley, but it seemed impossible to escape the smell. With each breath, the stench seemed to stick to me, permeating my clothes and skin as if it were something I couldn't abandon. That night, sleep didn't come. I stayed in the living room, thoughts incessantly repeating the images of that day. And as if that weren't enough, in the same week, something unexpected happened. I was close to closing an important contract with an organic produce distributor, something that had been in the works for weeks. It would have been a great deal with significant profit, something we had been waiting for months. But suddenly, everything fell apart. The distributor canceled the contract without prior notice or a convincing explanation. They just said they had changed plans. The news was a hard blow. We were counting on that money to resolve some pending house issues and advance payments for the children's school. Sarah tried to comfort me, saying I would soon find another client. But something about the way it all happened didn't seem normal to me. Shortly after, another situation arose. Sarah had been tending to some pepper plants in the front garden. She dedicated time and care, watering them daily, ensuring sufficient light, and was proud to see the first fruits beginning to appear. However, suddenly, the leaves began to wilt. At first, we thought it was something simple, perhaps the climate or a passing pest. However, the leaves continued to dry up and fall, and the peppers that were sprouting began to rot, turning black and soft. Sarah was devastated. She had cared for those plants with such zeal, and couldn't understand what was happening. We tried various solutions, changed the watering, checked the soil, but nothing worked. In the end, we had to pull out the plants. The empty space left in the garden seemed to reflect the growing feeling inside the house, a mixture of frustration and restlessness. And then there was the house itself, a place we had built with so much effort and dreams, but which in recent weeks seemed to have changed. It was hard to explain, but there was something strange. The environment was heavy, as if the walls carried an invisible tension. Every time I entered after a long day, I felt discomfort in my stomach, an inexplicable knot that had never existed before. One afternoon, while reviewing some papers in the living room, I heard a sharp scream coming from the kitchen. It was childlike and loud, and my first thought was it was my daughter. I got up immediately, heart racing. Upon entering the kitchen, I saw Sarah standing by the stove, our youngest son in her arms, and the other children seated at the table. No one seemed scared. "What happened? Who screamed?" I asked, looking at my daughter. She looked at me with surprise, as if she had no idea what I was talking about. "Scream? I didn't scream, Dad," she answered calmly while chewing a piece of tortilla. My wife gave me a suspicious look, her forehead slightly furrowed. "No one screamed, Marcus. We've been here for a while, and nothing happened." I paused for a moment, studying the expression of everyone around. "I heard it," I insisted with a conviction I hadn't planned to demonstrate. "Someone screamed. I'm certain. And it was right here." Without saying anything else, I returned to the living room, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. But deep down, something told me otherwise. The discomfort that had been growing in me over the past weeks now seemed more present than ever. A few days later, arriving home from work, as I unlocked the gate to park my pickup, I saw a neighbor approach. It was Mr. Jenkins, the oldest man on the street, known for always riding his ancient bicycle. We had exchanged a few words, but never really talked. "Have you heard, Marcus? That young man who vandalized your gate was kicked out of here. Seems they caught him stealing from a small market downtown. The owner saw everything. They said if he shows up around here again, he's going to be in big trouble." I remained silent for a moment, absorbing the information. A sudden relief came over me. Knowing that the young man who had caused so much discomfort was no longer around brought a tranquility I hadn't felt for weeks. I thanked him for the news as Mr. Jenkins got on his bicycle and rode down the street. One night when the children were already asleep and my wife had gone to bed, I stayed in the living room reviewing work papers. I tried to concentrate, but the strange climate inside the house seemed to make everything more difficult. It was close to 11 o'clock when I decided to go out to the yard to check on the pickup. I had a habit of verifying that the gate and house door were properly locked before going to bed. But that night, it seemed almost mandatory to confirm twice, as if this could prevent something worse. I took my phone and used the flashlight to illuminate the path to the gate. I pushed it slightly, just to ensure it was well closed. Everything seemed in order. Then I turned to the main door and checked the lock again. The silence of the house was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of crickets. It was then that, looking at the pickup parked near the gate, I noticed something on the passenger seat through the windshield. There was a figure sitting there. The silhouette was dark, without defined features, but unmistakably human. It didn't move, as if it were staring at me. For a moment the air vanished from my lungs, and my body was paralyzed, unable to react. Suddenly the shadow moved. It wasn't a brusque or hurried movement. It just slowly bent down, trying to hide behind the dashboard. The dread I felt was suffocating. It wasn't just the sight of something unusual, but the certainty that it knew I was there, looking at it. I took a deep breath and gathered all the courage I had to take a step toward the vehicle. My hand trembled as I held the driver's door handle. It was as if every fiber of my body was begging me to retreat. But with effort, I opened the door and leaned in to see the interior. The passenger seat was empty. There was no one, nothing, just the silence of the night and my racing heart echoing in my chest. I used the phone light to examine every corner of the vehicle's interior, from the floor to the back seats, but found nothing unusual. I remained standing there with the pickup door open, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. I was absolutely certain I had seen someone. There had been someone sitting in the passenger seat, staring fixedly at me. It couldn't be imagination. The days that came after brought a growing unease. My wife began to get sick. At first, we thought it was just a flu or something she had eaten, but the symptoms became increasingly alarming. Nausea would come suddenly, without warning. Several times she would say she was fine, but in a matter of minutes she would start vomiting. It was so sudden that she couldn't even make it to the bathroom in time. She would stay right where she was, with tears in her eyes, apologizing while trying to clean herself up. At first, we tried not to pay much attention. "It must be some food that made me sick," she would say, washing her hands or changing clothes. But as time passed, the episodes increased in frequency and intensity. Sometimes the crises would come while she was cooking or taking care of the children. It seemed that something invisible was attacking her unexpectedly, leaving her fragile and exhausted. One afternoon, as I was finishing tending to the front garden, I heard my son's cry coming from inside the house. I ran to see what had happened, thinking he had fallen or hurt himself, but the scene I found paralyzed me. My wife was sitting in the living room, holding our son in her arms. Her clothes were completely soiled with vomit. The little one cried uncontrollably, with his little hands covered by the liquid she couldn't contain. "I'm sorry," she murmured, crying too. There wasn't time to get to the bathroom. Her face was pale, her hands trembled while trying to calm our son, who continued to cry. I helped her up and took our boy to the kitchen, where I washed his hands and face, while Sarah went to the bathroom to clean herself up. Even while occupied caring for him, my mind couldn't stop revisiting what I had just witnessed. I took my wife to the doctor. Various tests were done, but none indicated anything abnormal. To the doctor, she was completely healthy, and there was no physical explanation for the symptoms. This only increased my concern. If it wasn't something medical, then what was causing it? Sarah seemed equally confused. "If there's nothing wrong with me, then why am I going through this?" she asked one night as we lay in bed. A few days later, my mother-in-law appeared at our house, carrying a large bag. Since we had moved, she had always been very attentive, concerned about our adaptation to the new neighborhood and the area's climate. But that day, there was something different in her expression. She seemed serious, almost tense. "I brought this for you," she said, removing from the bag a framed image of the Virgin Mary. It was a beautiful piece with an antique, almost sacred air. She looked at us firmly while holding the frame. "I want you to put it in the living room. She will bless the house and protect you." My wife received the frame with delicacy, thanking her for the gesture. My mother-in-law had always had an unwavering faith. Although I didn't share that devotion with the same intensity, I understood the value it had for both her and Sarah. We placed the image in the living room on a shelf facing the sofa, and my mother-in-law lit a small candle she had brought with her. Before leaving, she gave us a serious look and said, "Marcus, you should seek help from someone who understands these things. There are spiritual advisors in the county who know how to cleanse bad energies." I was speechless. Sarah looked quickly at me, seeking my reaction, but I just nodded in agreement, thanking her for her concern. I didn't want to increase her worry, but those words kept resonating in my mind. Although I had never given credit to these beliefs, I began to question my skepticism. At work, it was common to hear colleagues talk about how they consulted psychics or spiritual healers to attract prosperity, close deals, or ward off bad luck. I always viewed this as superstition, a way some found to deal with life's uncertainties. However, given everything we were experiencing at home, the possibility that there might be something real behind it all began to bother me. That night, looking at the Virgin Mary image, now illuminated by the gentle flame of the candle, my mother-in-law's words returned to my mind. Perhaps seeking a spiritual advisor could help. Perhaps there was no risk in trying. But at the same time, something inside me resisted. I feared discovering that what we were facing was really something beyond the natural. In the days that followed, things seemed a bit calmer. But soon, a new discomfort began to emerge in such a subtle way that it took me a while to notice. One night, as I was heading to the children's room to wish them good night, I sensed a strange odor. It was an unpleasant smell, mild but notable, reminiscent of spoiled meat. Upon entering the room, I found the children lying down, almost asleep. I approached my daughter first, kissed her forehead, and adjusted her blanket. I did the same with my sons, but as I leaned over them, the smell became more evident. It seemed to come from them, not from their clothes or the environment, but as if it were impregnated in them. I moved away, intrigued, and inhaled again. The odor was still there, weak but nauseating, as if something were deteriorating near them. I stood there for a moment, watching them sleep. Their breathing was serene, their faces peaceful, but the smell remained. Everything that had happened in recent weeks began to pass through my mind. It was as if each small event was interconnected, suggesting that something invisible was taking over our house, little by little. Perhaps my mother-in-law was right, I thought. Perhaps it was time to seek someone who understood these things, someone who could help us understand, and more importantly, stop whatever it was. Even considering the possibility, something inside me was reluctant. I didn't want to accept that something out of the ordinary could be happening. I didn't want to believe that our home, built with so much effort, was becoming a hostile and strange place. But the reality was that I could no longer ignore it. Something was affecting my family, and the fear that it might worsen made me feel a weight in my chest. It was past 1 a.m. when a dry noise broke the silence, a loud, strong bang, as if stones were being thrown against the gate. Sarah woke up first, sitting up suddenly in bed and shaking me by the shoulder. I got up immediately, heart racing. Another blow sounded more intense, followed by another and yet another, as if someone were unloading their rage on the metal gate. The sound reverberated throughout the house, frightening and deafening. In the next room, the children began to cry. Sarah got up, distressed, to try to calm them, while I desperately searched for my phone to check the security cameras. My hands trembled as I opened the app, and the time the image took to load seemed like an eternity. When it finally appeared, I felt a knot in my throat. There was no one in front of the gate. I brought the phone closer to my face, trying to make sure I wasn't seeing wrong. The transmission showed a completely empty street. illuminated only by the yellowish light of the street lamps. But the blows continued, getting louder, as if something invisible were pounding on the front door. A shiver ran through my body, leaving my skin ice cold. "What's happening?" asked Sarah, holding our youngest son in her arms while the other two clung to her, frightened. Her voice was trembling, and her eyes reflected the same dread I felt. "There's no one out there," I responded, trying to stay calm, although my own voice betrayed my nervousness. She stared at me incredulously. "What do you mean?" "We clearly hear it." I didn't know what to answer. If there was no one outside, then where were the noises coming from? A terrible idea crossed my mind, leaving me even more uneasy. What if the sounds weren't coming from outside, but from inside? I took a deep breath, trying to dismiss the thought, and went to the living room. I looked out the window toward the yard, hoping to find something that would explain what was happening. The plants remained motionless under the cold light of the moon. The wall was intact, and the yard door remained well locked. Nothing seemed out of place. Suddenly, the noises ceased. The silence that settled was so deep that I could hear the irregular sound of my own breathing. I remained motionless by the window, looking at the yard and checking the phone again. I switched cameras to see different angles, looking for any sign, a figure, a movement, even a shadow that could justify the blows. But there was nothing. The street remained deserted, and the gate was perfectly closed. I returned to the bedroom, still trying to digest what had just happened. Sarah was sitting on the bed with the children beside her, hugging her. "Everything's locked," I said, knowing my words wouldn't be enough to reassure her. Nobody got in. That night, we decided it would be safer to all sleep in the same room. We improvised a comfortable space on the floor with mattresses and blankets, so the children could stay close to us. Any sound, whether the creaking of walls or a snap in the ceiling, put my body on alert. Although there were no signs of invasion, the feeling that something was wrong persisted. Exhaustion, however, eventually overcame me, and I fell asleep next to my family. But fear didn't abandon me, not even in dreams. I relived the blows, the gate violently shaking, and a shadow crossing, entering the house while I remained powerless. After that night, we realized we could no longer ignore it. The climate inside the house was unbearable, and the feeling of helplessness in protecting my family against something incomprehensible consumed me. It was then that I remembered my mother-in-law's words about seeking help from a spiritual advisor. Even with all my skepticism, it was the only alternative left. Sarah found a recommended spiritual healer, a woman of about 50 who lived in a quiet part of town. When we arrived at her house, something about her countenance reminded me of my mother-in-law. She received us with a serene smile and welcoming gestures. Her house was simple but full of life, decorated with plants and religious figures. In a corner, a small table caught attention, covered with a white cloth, housing lit candles, a glass of water, and a noticeably worn deck of cards. With a calm voice, she asked us to take her to our house that very afternoon. "I need to feel the energies in the place where everything is happening. Only then can I help." Once at our house, the spiritual healer analyzed every detail with an attentive eye. She sat in the living room in front of the Virgin Mary image that my mother-in-law had given us, and began to arrange the cards on the table. in a sequence that seemed loaded with meaning. Sarah and I sat down while she, with firm hands, moved the cards as part of a deeply rooted ritual. The already heavy environment seemed to grow denser with each moment. After a few minutes of silence, she raised her eyes and spoke. "There's a very heavy energy here. This isn't something that arose by chance. It was done to you. It's someone's work, a woman." Her eyes fixed on me as if expecting me to recognize who she was talking about. "It's someone with resentment, someone who doesn't want you to prosper. This energy isn't just in the house, but in you. It was made to weaken and destabilize you as a family, to take away the peace of the home." As she explained, a memory chilled my spine. My mind immediately went back to the woman I had seen at the house of the young man who had vandalized our gate, his girlfriend. The coldness in her face and the suspicious look appeared with disturbing clarity. Everything made sense. The age, the connection to the young man, and the strange attitude that day. My whole body shivered, and the room seemed to suffocate with the weight of the spiritual healer's words. "What can we do?" I asked, feeling the fear growing inside me and transforming into desperation. She asked us to go to the yard while she initiated the ritual. She lit incense and candles, murmuring prayers in a low tone that was difficult to understand. She walked through the house calmly, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. As I watched her, I felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this woman could help us reclaim our lives. It's been almost a year since that night, when we decided to seek the spiritual healer's help. They were months filled with prayers, rituals, and cleansings that initially seemed strange to me, but over time began to transform our house. Gradually, the suffocating sensation that seemed to permeate every corner disappeared, like a heavy veil being slowly lifted. The children, previously restless and sometimes frightened, began to laugh naturally again, running through the yard without fear. My youngest son stopped waking up crying at night, and my daughter began sleeping deeply. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed like a different person. The vomiting episodes ceased a few weeks after the rituals began. She regained her energy, and seeing the sparkle in her eyes again brought a tranquility I didn't even know I needed. The changes also reached my work. Difficulties that previously seemed insurmountable began to disappear. New deals were closed with surprising ease, and opportunities that once seemed distant now emerged naturally. As if something invisible had changed the direction of the wind in our favor. Even with all these improvements, I never managed to completely understand what happened. Throughout the year, I found myself wishing for clear answers, something that would explain why our family was the target of something so heavy. But those answers never came. I presume the woman who harmed us left along with the young man when he was expelled from Willow Creek. We did nothing to provoke them. We just wanted to build our home and live in peace. But for them, that was enough to transform us into targets. This experience showed me something difficult to accept. Some people harbor resentment without apparent reason, no matter how kind or fair you try to be. Some people need just the smallest pretext to spread their anger. And often, that hatred has nothing to do with you, but with something broken inside them. You just become the target of a frustration that isn't yours. Today, looking at our house, I see much more than walls and a roof. It represents what we overcame together as a family. Each detail, Each corner carries the memory of what we faced and the strength we found to move forward. The image of the Virgin Mary remains in the same place, on the shelf in the living room, and the candle we light every night is a silent reminder of everything we experienced. I don't know if it was her protection, the work of the spiritual healer, or just our determination that helped us through all this, but I am immensely grateful. And although there are still things I can't understand, I learned something valuable. There is always a path to move forward and protect what we love. The house on Willow Creek stands stronger now, not just in its physical structure, but in what it represents for us, a testament to resilience, family bonds, and the mysterious forces that sometimes test our resolve. The neighbors who once kept their distance now stop by regularly for coffee on Sunday afternoons. The garden Sarah tends is flourishing with vegetables and flowers she never thought would grow there. There's a peace now that I can't quite explain, a harmony that comes from surviving something that tried to break us apart. We don't talk about those days much anymore, except occasionally when one of us catches a strange shadow in the corner of our eye, or when the wind makes a peculiar sound against the windows at night. Sometimes I think I see that woman's face in a crowd downtown, or I imagine the young man watching our house from across the street. But whether these are real sightings or just echoes of a troubled time, I'm no longer afraid. Our home has weathered the storm, and so have we. Last week, as I was fixing the fence in the backyard, Mr. Jenkins pedaled by on his ancient bicycle. He stopped, leaning against our gate. "Your family's done well here after all," he said, with a knowing look in his eyes. "Most folks would have packed up and left after what you all went through." I nodded, running my hand along the white gate that once bore the marks of vandalism, but now stood pristine in the afternoon sun. "Some things are worth fighting for," I replied. He smiled and rode off, the squeaking of his bicycle fading down Willow Creek Road. That night I walked through each room of our house before bed, as has become my custom. The children slept peacefully, no strange odors lingering around them. Sarah was already in bed, reading a novel with a contentment I once feared we'd never reclaim. I paused in the living room, looking at the Virgin Mary illuminated by the soft glow of the candle. Whatever darkness had once tried to claim this space was gone now, banished by something stronger than hatred or envy, or whatever had motivated that woman to target us. As I turned out the light and headed to bed, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window glass. Behind me, the empty room stretched quiet and still. No shadows, no figures, no whispers. Just a home finally at peace. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.